Hello and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel After Dark. Tonight we're drifting off into the rich history of Mission Concepción in San Antonio, Texas, and how it became the only renowned and oldest unrestored stone church in the United States, and also how it is the only church in the world that lights up two distinct spots, one of which is a 300-plus year original painting, inside the walls every year at the exact same time. It's something truly remarkable to witness. But before we dive in, be sure to check out the video description below for resources to help you relax and fall asleep naturally. Ready to begin? Let's dive in. There's a place in San Antonio, Texas, where the ancient and the eternal seem to breathe from the same set of stone lungs, where the walls still hold the memory of hands that shaped them nearly 300 years ago, and where once a year, on a single sacred evening, the setting sun reaches through two small windows and does something that has never been reliably documented anywhere else on Earth at the same moment. It lights up a painting and a floor at the exact same time. Not one, both, simultaneously. People who witness it for the first time go quiet, and then, almost always, someone gasps. This is the story of Mission Concepción. But to understand what she has become, you have to understand where she began. And that beginning is not in San Antonio at all. It is in the dense piney forests of East Texas, somewhere near what is today Nacogdoches County, in the summer of 1716. The year is important. Spain and France are playing an enormous chess match across the North American continent, and every mission, every presidio, every cross plant in the ground is a move on that board. The Spanish crown is nervous about French expansion out of Louisiana, and so it commissions an expedition, the Domingo Ramon expedition, to push deep into East Texas and establish a chain of Franciscan missions that will serve as both spiritual outposts and political anchors. 6 missions are planted in that effort. Concepción is the second of those 6 Franciscan missions established on both sides of the present Texas-Louisiana border. It is founded on July 7, 1716, by a priest named Fray Isidro Felix de Espinosa in a wooded area near 2 springs, located on the east bank of the Angelina River. At that moment, it carries a long and reverent name, Nuestra Señora de la Purísima Concepción de los Hainais, Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception of the Hazanai people. The Hazanai, they are a Cadón people, farmers and traders, deeply rooted in the land. Their name, by some accounts, is where the very word Texas originates, from the Hazanai greeting Tejas, meaning friends or allies. The Franciscan friars come to them with faith and with mission, and at first, thousands of Tejas Indians are reported as candidates for the new missions. The friars build temporary huts. They begin baptisms almost immediately. There is real enthusiasm in those early days, a sense that something extraordinary is being built at the intersection of 2 worlds. But the land does not cooperate. A severe drought results in a poor harvest and hunger. Mission inhabitants are forced to hunt crows for food. A serious epidemic breaks out, and hundreds of indigenous people die. Supply lines for Mexico are thin and unreliable. And then, in 1719, the political situation shatters everything. Spain and France go to war in Europe, and news reaches the French in Louisiana first. They cross the border and seize a Spanish mission in a matter of days. The Franciscans, caught between empires, retreat. Espinosa and his fellow priest Antonio Margel de Jesus reluctantly join the Spanish withdrawal, leaving everything behind. It is a devastating moment, but it is not the end. Here is where the story takes a turn toward the mystical. Because before we follow this mission on its long journey toward San Antonio, We need to pause and understand a presence that shaped this spiritual landscape of this entire region long before those first Franciscan boots touched East Texas soil. She is known to history as the Lady in Blue. Her real name is Maria de Jesus de Agreda, and she never once set foot in the New World. At least, not physically. Born Maria Coronel Guadarrama on April 2nd, 1602, in the Spanish town of Agreda, she grows up in a deeply religious family with close ties to Franciscan friars. At the age of 16, she convinces her father to convert the family castle into a convent for Franciscan nuns. She takes her religious vows on February 2nd, 1620, in the name Maria de Jesus. And then, throughout the 1620s, something extraordinary begins to happen. She falls into deep trances and reports being transported, body or soul. No one can entirely agree. Across the ocean to a distant and unknown land, where she teaches the gospel to indigenous people she has never met, in a language she does not speak, yet somehow they understand her. Her bilocation activity is said to have occurred between her cloistered monastery in rural Spain and the Germano Indians of central New Mexico and West Texas. She reportedly makes these miraculous journeys hundreds of times. Sister Maria would later admit to experiencing some 500 bilocations to New Spain. The story becomes verifiable, or at least corroborated, in the summer of 1629. A delegation of some 50 Germano Indians appears at a Franciscan convent south of present-day Albuquerque, asking for missionaries and demonstrating rudimentary knowledge of Christianity. When asked who had instructed them, they say simply, "The woman in blue." They describe her cloak. They describe her face. They describe her visits. And when they are shown a painting of a nun in a blue habit, they recognize it immediately. Father Benavides' missionaries baptized thousands of Indians in that visit alone, including other indigenous tribes who show up when they hear the missionaries are there. When those other tribes are asked who told them to seek baptism, they reply the same way, "The Lady in Blue." It is in this spirit that the mission in East Texas, after being reorganized in the aftermath of drought and hardship, is given a new name, Concepción de Agreda, in honor of Maria de Jesus de Agreda, the Lady in Blue herself. It is a naming that ties the mission directly to one of the most mysterious and debated religious figures in the history of the American Southwest. Whether you believe in her miraculous bilocations or not, she is woven into the founding DNA of this church. Every time the name Concepción is spoken, somewhere underneath is the whisper of that blue cloak moving through the Texas wind. The mission regroups. By 1721, the Spanish return to East Texas in force, and 400 Indians, including 80 Catadachos from the Red River area, are present at the solemn ceremony of the re-establishment of Mission Concepción on August 8, 1721. Things rebuild slowly, but the East Texas location remains difficult. The farming Hazanai people are harder to settle into the mission model than the hunters and gatherers of South Texas, who are under constant pressure from mounted Apache raids and actively seek the protection the missions can offer. The calculus of survival is complicated, and the friars know it. And so the decision comes. In 1729, Spain orders a partial withdrawal from East Texas. The Franciscans protest. Fray Vergara chairs a meeting of the 7 Queretaran missionaries in the area, who co-sign a protest against the decision. But the order stands. The missions begin to move. First they try the Colorado River, somewhere near present-day Austin. That doesn't work either. And finally, in the early months of 1731, on March 5th, Mission Concepción is refounded on the east bank of the San Antonio River, settling between the already established Mission San Antonio de Valero to the north, the one that history will later call the Alamo, and Mission San Jose to the south. After 15 years of drought and disease and displacement, this mission has finally found its home. An estimated 300 Native Americans are brought into the mission when it is founded here. They come from a patchwork of South Texas and Gulf Coast peoples. Three principal groups present at the possession ceremony are the Paxalotes, Barretos, and Manos de Pero. Within just 2 years, a total of 12 different Native groups are living within the mission, and between 1734 and 1775, members of another 25 Native groups will join. They come not as conquered people, exactly, but as survivors, drawn by the promise of food, protection from Apache raids, and a spiritual community that, for all its colonial complexity, offers something their fractured world no longer can. They come, and they build. The limestone is right there, quarried from the mission grounds themselves. Stones from a nearby quarry are used to build more permanent buildings and walls. Adobe and thatched huts give way to solid, enduring structures. And over the next 2 decades, something remarkable rises from the South Texas soil. Constructed over 15 years and dedicated in 1755, the limestone, cruciform church takes its place on the landscape as a testament to what human beings can achieve when faith and labor and artistry are combined. Mission Concepción is the oldest unrestored stone church in America. That is not a small claim. That is not a tourist brochure decoration. This church has never fallen into ruin. It has never been torn down and rebuilt. The walls you can touch today are the walls that those Native American and Spanish hands set in place in the 18th century. When you stand inside, you are standing inside the same proportions of space and light that those first worshipers stood inside. The ceiling curves overhead the same way. The stone breathes the same coolness. There is a continuity here that very few buildings on this continent can claim. And the walls. Once, the walls were something beyond imagination. In its heyday, bright and colorful geometric designs covered the entire surface of the church, inside and out. The technique was fresco, mineral pigment, wet lime plaster, limestone, water, and possibly goat's milk were used to make a paint-like plaster substance that dried and hardened into limestone as the colors became permanent. The palette was vivid, for colors were used: yellow, red, black, and blue. From a distance, this church would have looked less like a fortress of pale stone and more like a living altar, painted with geometry and devotion. If you look closely at the bell towers today, you can still see remnants of red pigment from the frescoes surrounding the bell tower windows. Inside the convento, the priest's residence attached to the church, the most famous of all the surviving artwork waits on a barrel-vaulted ceiling. 4 generations, people called it the Eye of God, a single great eye, looking down from above with what felt like divine attention. But then in 1988, preservation work revealed a second eye, and with it, the possibility that this famous fresco may not have been purely religious at all, but perhaps a depiction of a human face. Some scholars now believe it may be a depiction of God as a mestizo Google arts and culture, a blending of Spanish and indigenous, the new face of a new world being born in the shadow of these walls. The Native American painters found unique ways to incorporate their own traditions throughout the construction of each church. Even in the act of building something for Spanish Catholic worship, the people whose hands and knowledge made it possible left pieces of themselves inside the stone. That is one of the quiet truths of Mission Concepción, that it was never purely one thing or one culture. It was always a conversation. Sometimes a difficult one, but a conversation. And then, once a year, the conversation becomes something else entirely. Every year on August 15th, at approximately 6:30 in the evening, 2 beams of light converge inside Mission Concepción. One enters through the window above the front door of the church. The other pierces through the dome window. They travel in silence across the old stone floors, up through the cool interior air, and at the precise moment when the late summer sun arcs to exactly the right point on the horizon, one ray illuminates the face of Mary as she is depicted in the painting of the Immaculate Conception hanging behind the altar, while a second ray illuminates the sanctuary floor at its center below the dome. Both at the same moment. Volunteers who have witnessed to describe what happens in the church. All you see is open mouths, dropped jaws, one says, and it gets completely quiet. A quiet like you've never known. Throughout the Southwest, several other old Spanish missions are home to solar illuminations on feast days, but double illuminations like at Mission Concepción are rare. The event falls on the Feast of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, and scholars believe the architects designed it this way deliberately, as a way to incorporate the sun, an important celestial element in Native American worship, and establish a common spiritual reference point between the two cultures coming together inside these walls. The man who first documented it in modern times is a mission tour guide and volunteer named George Dawson. He had read research about solar illuminations in the California missions and wanted to see if it was true here. So he did his own research and went out with his compass. He eventually invited researcher Ruben Mendoza to verify his findings. And what they confirmed is something the builders of this church knew in 1755 and encoded in limestone and light for every generation that would ever stand inside. That the sky is part of the church. That the sun, on this one day, is invited in. That is where we begin. In 1716, in a piney forest in East Texas, with a Franciscan priest planting a cross in the ground and giving a mission the name of the Immaculate Conception, with a Spanish nun in a blue cloak somewhere between waking and dreaming, traveling across an ocean she would never cross in her body, with a people called the Hazanai, in a drought, and crows hunted for food, and the slow, painful crawl of a mission toward its true home on the banks of the San Antonio River. The walls are waiting. The limestone is waiting. And on one evening each year, the sun still comes in through those two small windows and lights up the face of Mary and touches the floor, and the church goes quiet. This is only the beginning of the story. So there it stands on the east bank of the San Antonio River in the year 1731. Newly arrived, newly planted, a mission that has already survived drought and epidemic and the collapse of empires, dragged across hundreds of miles of Texas wilderness to find this soft bend in the river where the land is dark and fertile and the water runs clean. But surviving the journey is one thing. Building a life, a real, functioning, breathing community from the ground up on the Texas frontier is something else entirely. Let's slow down and step inside that world. The mission is not just a church. It is a complete civilization in miniature, a walled compound designed to be entirely self-sufficient. There is a granary for storing the harvest. There are workshops where people learn blacksmithing, weaving, and carpentry. There are quarters for the native residents, built in two parallel rows flanking the friary. There's a kitchen that would eventually produce a cuisine neither fully Spanish nor fully indigenous, but something new. Corn and beans and chili peppers mixing with wheat and beef cattle in combinations that a modern Texan would recognize immediately as the deep root of what they eat today. The missions of San Antonio are, in ways most people never think about, the origin point of Texas food culture. But the foundation of everything, the literal lifeline of the entire community, is water. The oldest acequia in the San Antonio area is the Concepción, or Apache Lake, built in 1729, which followed a route running along what is now Garden and Roosevelt Streets to Mission Concepción, and from there to its lands further south. An acequia is an irrigation canal, a technology the Spanish inherited from the Moors, brought across an ocean and adapted to the semi-arid Texas landscape with remarkable ingenuity. According to tradition, the Concepción acequia was the largest of the irrigation canals in the region, and was of ample size to allow the Franciscans to employ small boats to transport themselves to and from the mission and to repair the canal. Imagine that, priests floating in small boats along a handmade canal through the South Texas wilderness, tending the very waterway that kept their community alive. This canal was in continual use until 1869, more than 140 years of uninterrupted service, carrying river water to fields that fed hundreds of people through drought and raid and revolution. The water it carried was not just practical. It was the difference between life and death on this frontier. And the fields it fed were productive in ways that surprised even the Spanish colonial officials who came to inspect. By 1745, the well-irrigated fields were producing 800 bushels of corn a year, plus large quantities of beans and other vegetables. A ranch farther away was well stocked with cattle and horses. The mission was succeeding. It was feeding itself. It was feeding others. By 1755, the year the church was completed, the population had risen to 247, and the mission had hundreds of cattle, sheep, and many horses. For a brief and shining window of time, Concepción was thriving. But the world surrounding this small island of order was not quiet. The Apaches are ever present. They raid the mission lands. They threaten the Coahuiltecan people who have settled here, many of whom came precisely because the mission walls offered protection that their scattered and diminished bands could no longer provide for themselves. It is one of the quiet ironies of the mission system that people came not only because of faith, but because of fear. Not fear of the priests, but fear of mounted raiders who struck without warning across the open grasslands. The missions, for all their colonial complexity, offered something that mattered terribly to people whose world had already been shattered by disease and displacement. Walls. Community. A harvest that would still be there in the morning. Peace was finally achieved between the Apaches and the Spanish by 1749, and that peace opened a new chapter. The mission entered its most productive years. The church itself, begun in the 1730s from limestone quarried directly from the mission grounds, rose slowly and steadily over 2 decades of labor. Constructed over 15 years and dedicated in 1755, it is a cruciform structure, shaped like a cross, with twin bell towers flanking the facade and a dome above the transept that will one day, on one specific evening each August, catch the last light of the sun and do something extraordinary with it. The people building it know what they are doing. These are not unskilled laborers piling stones. The decorative elements combine Catholic symbols with indigenous natural designs, reflecting indigenous artisans' contributions and creating visual languages distinct from purely Spanish Baroque expression. The native craftsmen who chip and set each stone, who mix the plaster for the frescoes, who climb the scaffolding and paint the walls in 4 bold colors. They are leaving themselves inside this building in ways that will take centuries to fully understand. Consider the painting. A large painting of Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception, measuring nearly 9.5 feet tall by 6.5 feet wide, was donated to the mission in the 18th century by wealthy art patrons in Mexico City, along with other furnishings for the newly established churches. She hangs behind the altar, Mary, in the classic iconography of her Immaculate Conception, robed and luminous, her face serene. She is the namesake of this church. She is the reason the mission carries its long title. She is, in many ways, its soul. But look closely at the painting. and something strange emerges. Above the head of Mary, barely visible even after careful restoration, are Hebrew letters, burnt gold in color, that refer to an ancient name for God. The presence of Hebrew text in a Catholic painting on a Spanish colonial frontier might seem startling. But art scholars note that the incorporation of Hebrew letters is not uncommon in Catholic iconography. The same word appears on the main altar at the cathedral in Siena and the exterior of St. Francis Cathedral in Santa Fe. It is a thread connecting this remote Texas church to a much larger tapestry of faith, art, and human longing that stretches back through centuries and across continents. And then the painting disappears. This is one of the great dramatic threads of Mission Concepcion's story. Not the battle that will come later, not the soldiers and the cannons, but a rolled-up canvas hidden in a cathedral attic for 150 years. When the missions were secularized in 1794, the painting was taken to San Fernando Cathedral. It remained in various storerooms there, forgotten, for a century and a half. It was not until 1949 that a Texas Catholic historian named Carlos Castaneda and two friends discovered the rolled canvases in the rafters above the stage in San Fernando Cathedral School. Even then, restoration was still decades away. The painting had suffered water damage and fire damage. A Swiss art restorer named Esther Schmitz-Siegfried eventually brought her back to something close to her original beauty. The restored painting was rededicated to Mission Concepcion in 2003, returning home after more than 200 years of wandering. She's back on her wall now, and every August 15th, the setting sun finds her face. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because the world outside these walls is about to change in ways that will put the mission, and everyone inside it, in grave danger. The Apache Peace of 1749 is only a partial relief. The Apaches were never the only threat. Beginning in the 1760s, attacks from Comanches and other northern tribes compel some Indians to leave the missions. The Comanche are a different kind of force entirely. Faster, more organized, more relentlessly expansive than the Apaches. They push south and west with the confidence of people who have mastered the horse and remade the entire ecology of the Southern Plains. The missions feel this pressure. People leave. Population numbers, which had climbed so promisingly through the 1740s and 1750s, begin to fall. And then, in 1739, before any of this, in the decade when the church itself was still being built, when the mission was at its most hopeful, the worst thing imaginable arrives. One of the earliest population counts for Mission Concepcion comes from early in 1739 and indicates that there were 250 native inhabitants in the mission prior to the smallpox measles epidemic that struck later that same year. By the first part of the following year, the mission population had been reduced in half, 250 people, and then, within the span of months, half of them are gone. There are no good words for what smallpox did to the indigenous people of Texas. It was not just a disease, it was a catastrophe that operated in waves, each one finding new populations with no immunity, no understanding of what was happening to them, no medicine that could touch it. In a community like Mission Concepcion, where people from a dozen different tribal groups lived in close quarters, sharing the same rooms, the same water, the same air, the disease moved like fire through dry grass. A census in 1745 indicated that there were 207 individuals in residence. A partial recovery, but a haunted one. The mission goes on. People are still born here, still baptized, still buried in the earth just outside the church walls. The acequia still runs. The corn still grows. But the community that existed before 1739 is never quite the same. The Viceroy himself, in a report from the 1790s, would compare the decadence of the remaining San Antonio missions with their previous opulence, noting the lack of government support and expressing disapproval of the slow, grinding process of secularization that was eating the missions alive. And that process, secularization, is its own quiet devastation. In 1778, the colonial government declares all unbranded cattle on the mission lands to be the property of the crown, stripping the missions of the livestock that sustained them. The missionaries protest furiously. Legal battles drag on for years. Private ranchers, who have long resented the mission's control of the best grazing lands, press every advantage. The missions, which were always supposed to exist for only 10 years before turning their communities over to civilian governance, have lasted nearly a century. And now the colonial machinery is finally, relentlessly, taking them apart. By 1786, there were only around 71 Indians living at Mission Concepcion. By 1794, the population falls to 38. That same year, the mission is secularized. The remaining natives receive land. The last resident missionary, Fray Joseph Maria de Jesus Camarena, is relieved of his duties. The land is partitioned into 26 plots. The great compound that once housed nearly 300 people, that once produced 800 bushels of corn in a single growing season, that once rang with the sound of blacksmiths and weavers and the daily bells of prayer, that compound is now mostly empty. By 1809, there are 21 Indians and 32 Spaniards living at the mission. The land is mostly uncultivated. There is no longer a herd of cattle. By 1819, church services are no longer held at all. Mexican independence brings final secularization, and Mission Concepcion finally ceases to be a mission in 1823. And then comes the moment that still feels like a wound when you read it. By the early 1850s, the church is being used as a barn by settlers and is filled with bats and farm animals. The walls of Mission Concepcion serve at different times as a church, a barn, a military storage camp, and a training ground. The oldest unrestored stone church in America. The building whose architects designed windows to catch the sun at the exact right angle on a specific feast day, whose walls were painted in 4 blazing colors by Native American artists who wove their own traditions into the stone, becomes a place to shelter livestock. But before all of that slow unraveling, before the secularization and the abandonment and the bats and the cattle filling the nave, one more thing happens. One extraordinary, violent, and historically pivotal thing. Something that will write Mission Concepcion's name into the story of an entire nation. Because it is October of 1835, and a small group of Texian rebels, somewhere in the brushy bends of the San Antonio River, is about to make a stand. Their names are James Bowie and James Fannin, and they are walking into what a historian would later call the first major engagement of the Texas Revolution. October of 1835, the mission that once held nearly 300 souls, that once rang with harvest bells and the sound of children and the daily rhythm of prayer, is quiet now. It has been mostly empty for years. The church is used for storage. The old convento walls are crumbling at the edges. What was once the most self-sufficient community on the Texas frontier has become little more than a landmark on a forgotten road south of San Antonio. But history is not finished with it yet, not by a long way. To understand what is about to happen here, you need to feel the temperature of Texas in the fall of 1835. The tension between Anglo-American settlers and the Mexican government has been building for years. The centralist policies of General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna have stripped the settler communities of many of the rights they believe they had been promised when they came to Texas under land grants. People are angry. People are armed. And on October 2nd, 1835, shots are fired in the town of Gonzales, where the Mexican army has come to recover a cannon that was loaned to the town for protection against raids. The people of Gonzales refuse to hand it over. That refusal, backed by a homemade banner reading, "Come and take it," becomes the first gunshot of the Texas Revolution. Within days, a volunteer army is forming. Men are pouring in from across the region. By mid-October, a newly organized Texian army under Stephen F. Austin, the first impresario to bring English-speaking settlers to Texas, has marched toward San Antonio de Bejar, where General Martin Perfecto de Cas, brother-in-law of Santa Anna himself, has arrived to take command of all Mexican forces in Texas. Austin's army reaches the outskirts of the city and begins a siege, but they need to get closer. On the evening of October 27th, Austin calls in his two most trusted field commanders. He orders James Bowie and James W. Fannin, Jr., to lead 90 men to find a protected position closer to the town. James Bowie. The name alone carries weight. He is already a legend, famous for his fighting prowess, for the knife that would bear his name, for audacious exploits that had made him one of the most talked about men on the Texas frontier. Stories of his exploits in the Sandbar fight and his search for the lost San Saba mine had been widely reported. He is the kind of man whose presence in a room changes the room. The scouting party moves north along the San Antonio River in the late afternoon, past the familiar shapes of Mission San Juan and Mission San Jose. They briefly skirmish with Mexican scouts who retreat toward the city. And then, approximately 2 miles from San Antonio de Bejar and 6 miles from the main Texian camp, the scouting party stops at Mission Concepción. They look at the landscape, and what they see is a natural fortress. 500 yards west of the mission, the San Antonio River curved in a small horseshoe shape, with the two sides of the river's curve approximately 100 yards apart. Trees shaded both sides of the broad river bottom, which lay about 6 feet below the level of the rolling prairie nearby. That 6-foot drop into the river gully, that is the key. A man crouching in that gully is invisible from the open prairie. He can fire up at anyone approaching and duck 6 feet down to reload in complete safety. The terrain is, almost accidentally, perfect for a small force to defend against a much larger one. Bowie and Fannin are supposed to scout and return immediately. Austin's orders are clear. Instead, they send a courier to bring Austin to them. The next morning, an angry Austin issues a statement threatening officers who chose not to follow orders with court-martial. But by then, the decision is already made. They're camping here, and General Cas, learning that the Texian army is split in two, seizes opportunity. The night of October 27th passes in the riverside dark under those old pecan trees, the mission rising silent on the high ground behind them, its stone walls cold, its bell towers empty. The men sleep in 2 groups, Fannin with 49 men on the south part of the horseshoe bend, Bowie and the rest of the northern curve. Pickets are posted. The river moves in the dark, and the fog begins to roll in from the west. Dawn breaks on October 28th, 1835, but it breaks into white. At 6 a.m., Colonel Domingo Ugurtiquia leaves Bejar with 275 Mexican soldiers and 2 cannons. The heavy fog delays their approach, and the Mexican soldiers do not reach Concepción until somewhere between 7:30 and 8 o'clock in the morning. A Mexican cavalry scout spots a Texian picket named Henry Carnes and fires first. Carnes fires back and sprints to the main camp, furious, not because he was nearly shot, but because the enemy ball had knocked the powder horn from his belt. "Boys," he announces to his comrades, "the scoundrels have shot off my powder horn." There's something almost theatrical about that detail. And then the fog becomes chaos. The Texians drop into the gully. They fire from its lip, then drop 6 feet to the river level to reload, then climb back up and fire again. It is a rhythm: shoot, drop, reload, rise, and it is devastatingly effective. The Mexican forces form a line on the prairie and advance behind their two cannons. The cannonballs and grape shot thrash through the pecan trees overhead. Witness Noah Smithwick later writes that the shot was raining down showers of ripe pecans, and that he saw men picking them up and eating them with as little concern as if a norther had blown them down. That is the sound of the first major battle of the Texas Revolution. Cannon fire in the fog, pecan nuts falling from the trees, men eating them calmly while the world erupts around them. Bowie shouts to his men, "Keep under cover, boys, and reserve your fire. We haven't a man to spare." The Mexican infantry charges. The Texians fire back with long rifles that massively outrange the Mexican smoothbore muskets. The Kentucky and Tennessee rifles the Texians carried had effective, aimed accuracy at 200 yards or greater against a man-sized target, far surpassing the smoothbore muskets carried by most Mexican infantry, whose practical range for aimed shots was under 100 yards. The Mexican volleys mostly pass over the Texians' heads. The Texian shots find their marks. The Mexican infantry charges 3 times. 3 times it falls back, bleeding. Mexican losses include 14 killed and 39 wounded, some of whom die later. Texian losses: 1 killed and 1 wounded. That lone Texian fatality is Richard Andrews, the first Texian soldier killed in the Texas Revolution. His blood spilled in the shadow of this 300-year story. Then, in the final minutes of the battle, something almost audacious happens. As the Mexican buglers sound retreat and the cavalry moves up to collect the wounded and the abandoned cannon, Bowie leads a charge out onto the open prairie. The Texians capture the cannon and turn it on the fleeing Mexican soldiers. A caisson goes out of control and careens through the shattered Mexican ranks. The whole battle lasts 30 minutes. 30 minutes from the first shot to the Mexican retreat. 30 minutes that will echo forward through everything that follows. The siege of Behar, the Alamo, San Jacinto, the Republic of Texas, statehood. All of it. The Battle of Concepción is the first encounter of a siege that ends 6 weeks later with the surrender of General Cos himself. And though the Texians will be defeated at the Alamo in March of 1836, they are victorious at San Jacinto, the deciding encounter that results in Texas winning its independence from Mexico. Historian Alan Barr attributes the Texian victory that morning to 3 things: able leadership, a strong position, and greater firepower. But there is something else worth noting, something that a historian named Hardin flags with some unease. The relative ease of the victory instilled in the Texians a reliance on their long rifles and a contempt for their enemies, a confidence that would not always be warranted, and that some believe contributed to overconfidence in the dark months ahead. Mission Concepción does not know any of this in the moment. The old walls absorb the smoke and the sound and the blood, as they have absorbed so much else. The pecan trees settle back into silence. The fog lifts, and the mission returns to what it has been for more than a decade. Empty, waiting. The Texas Revolution roars on without it. The Alamo falls in February of 1836. Sam Houston's army wins at San Jacinto on April 21st. Texas becomes a republic, then a state. The years turn, and the church on the river road south of San Antonio, the one used for a while as a barn, then as a military storage depot, then as a training ground, sits in the sun and waits to be remembered. The remembering begins slowly. In 1855, Marian friars acquire the mission and restore the church and open a novitiate, which only operates for a few years. Masses resume on May 28, 1861. The Civil War comes and goes. San Antonio grows. Roads are paved. the city creeps southward, and the mission, still standing in its ancient limestone patience, is gradually rediscovered by a city that is beginning to understand what it has. On April 15th, 1970, Mission Concepción is designated a National Historic Landmark, an official declaration that this place is irreplaceable, that it carries within its walls something the nation cannot afford to lose. 8 years later, it becomes part of the San Antonio Mission's National Historical Park. Restoration work follows in waves. In 1988, experts restore some of the artwork on the interior ceilings and walls of the convento. It is during this work that the Eye of God fresco reveals its second eye, the discovery that rewrites what everyone thought they knew about the most famous image inside this church. In 2010, the Archdiocese of San Antonio completes another restoration of the mission's interior, this one exposing more frescoes in the sanctuary and nave that have been hidden under centuries of accumulated lime wash and decay. More hands, more colors, more of the original vision bleeding back through the walls. And more recently, during work on the Great Central Dome, conservators discover painted plaster fragments and graffiti from the original builders themselves, tucked inside the rubble fill of the dome structure. Small, anonymous marks left by the people who built this place, surviving 3 centuries inside the very walls they raised. The dome itself stands over 50 feet high, and it has not always been stable. In 2016, a structural assessment finds serious cracks caused by the outward lateral pressure from gravity on the bottom of the dome's shape. A continuous metal tension band is added around the drum of the dome to resist the lateral forces and ensure the structure's stability. The oldest unrestored stone church in America requires tending. It always has. The work of preservation is never finished. It is just passed from one generation of stewards to the next. And then, on July 5th, 2015, comes the moment that places this mission in the company of the world's most treasured sites. The United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization designates Mission Concepción and 4 other San Antonio missions, including the Alamo, as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the first in Texas, and one of only 23 in the United States at the time. Think about what that means. This is a list that includes the pyramids of Giza, the Great Wall of China, the historic center of Rome, Machu Picchu, and now, a limestone church on a river road in South Texas, built by the hands of Franciscan friars and Coahuiltecan laborers, where once a year the setting sun reaches through 2 small windows and touches the face of Mary and the floor at the exact same moment, and the whole congregation goes quiet. Today, more than 1 million people visit Mission Concepción each year as part of the national park system. More than 135 families worship here as an active parish. Catholic Mass is still held at the mission every Sunday. The descendants of the people who built it still live throughout the region. The same San Antonio River still runs to the west of it, past the same cottonwood trees, through a landscape that is recognizable even now to the ghost of every person who ever called this place home. Each December, more than 400 Mattachine dancers gather on the grounds in colorful traditional dress, performing devotions that have been part of the life of Mission Concepción since the 1770s. Traveling from the river up to the mission in a procession of prayer and color and rhythm that connects this present moment to something that reaches back 3 centuries and more. The mission is not a museum. It is not a ruin. It is not a monument frozen behind glass. It is a living thing, alive the way a river is alive, changing at the surface while the deep current runs steady and true beneath. And every single year, on the evening of August 15th, the sun goes down in the west, the light changes, and 2 beams find their way through 2 small windows. One finds the floor, One finds Mary's face, and for a moment, the whole long, improbable story of this place, the drought in East Texas, the lady in blue, the smallpox, the acequia boats, the cannon in the pecan trees, the bats in the nave, the rolled canvas in the cathedral rafters, all of it comes to rest in a single breath of light. And the church goes quiet. This has been the story of Mission Concepción. Not all of it. Never all of it. There are still the archaeological layers not yet excavated, the marriage records not yet translated, the names of the builders not yet recovered from 3 centuries of silence. But this is where we begin, with a place that has been called by many names, that has seen the full sweep of human experience pass through its doors, and that still stands, still breathing, still beautiful, still catching the light, on the banks of the San Antonio River, 3 miles south of downtown, where it has always been. Some buildings hold the past. This one holds the past and the present and something that reaches toward the future. And if you go there on a clear August evening, just before 6:30, and take a seat in one of the old wooden pews and wait, you will feel it. The oldest unrestored stone church in America. The first World Heritage Site in Texas. The site of the first major battle of the Texas Revolution. The place where a sun sets once a year and does something it does nowhere else on earth. Mission Concepción. Still standing. Still lit. We have walked through the founding. We have walked through the building and the flourishing and the slow unraveling. We have stood in the fog on that October morning in 1835 and heard the pecans falling from the trees. We have watched the mission become a barn, and then a battlefield, and then a landmark, and finally a World Heritage Site with more than 1 million visitors a year. But there is something we have not done yet in this story. We have not stopped to truly look at the building itself, to walk around it slowly, to ask what it is actually made of, what minds designed it, what hands shaped it, and what all of those choices mean. Because Mission Concepción is not merely a historical event that happened to require a building. The building is itself a text, a document written in limestone and light, in geometry and pigment, that tells you everything about the people who made it, if you know how to read it. So let's read it. Stand in front of the western facade, the main face of the church that greets you as you walk across the old mission grounds. The first thing that strikes you is the symmetry. 2 bell towers rise on either side of the central entrance, called campanarios, framing the facade with a sense of formal, balanced authority. Between the towers on the front facade is an elaborately carved portal, and above it a niche that was originally designed to hold a statue of Mary Immaculate, the church's namesake, the woman in whose honor this whole enterprise was dedicated. Her niche is empty now, the statue long gone, but the shape of it remains, a carved limestone hollow waiting, still for her return. The simple triangle above the portal is matched by similarly bold pyramids, which cap the 2 towers. It is a restrained geometry, powerful without being ornate, solemn without being cold. This is a building that understands scale. It knows how to make a person feel small without making them feel crushed. That is an architectural achievement that many much grander buildings never manage. The stone itself has a name. A whiter, denser limestone, sometimes called Concepción stone, was used for the exposed facades and stone ornament the material of this building so particular to this place that it carries the mission's name. It was quarried right here on the mission grounds by the people who lived here. The stone under your feet and the stone in the walls came from the same earth. There is something about that circularity that feels important, that the land itself was incorporated into the building that was built to serve the people of that land. Look up at those walls, and you're looking at construction knowledge that stretches back to the Roman Empire. Church buildings were built with composite wall systems. cut stone outer walls with rubble stone and lime slurry filling the core, reflecting technical knowledge of European construction systems that date back thousands of years. But this knowledge did not arrive here intact. It was translated, adapted, carried across an ocean, and reinterpreted by builders who had never seen the churches of Spain, working in a climate and with materials they were encountering for the first time. Now step inside. Your eyes adjust. The light changes character immediately. It becomes something softer, something that feels selected, as if the building has decided which rays of sunlight are worthy of entry. And that is not an accident. Priests and master builders designed mission churches to manipulate sunlight for ornamental and religious purposes, channeling it to illuminate symbolically the sanctuary, its source unseen by the worshiper in the nave. Every window in this church is a decision. Every opening is an argument about where sacred attention should fall. The plan of the church is a Latin cross, what architects call a cruciform plan. The bottom portion is designated as the nave, the upper portion as the apse housing the sanctuary, and the transepts on either side of the crossing contain chapels. Above the crossing, a hemispherical dome covers the sanctuary, symbolizing the celestial heavens. You are standing, in other words, inside a three-dimensional theological argument about the shape of the cosmos. The cross on the ground, heaven above at the dome, the congregation in the nave reaching toward the altar and the light. That central dome soars more than 50 feet above the floor, and it is one of the most extraordinary things about this interior. In a building made of stone, on a Texas frontier where lumber was scarce and professional craftsmen were few, someone looked at a crossing of two stone barrel vaults and decided to crown it with a dome. The dome of Mission Concepción was created using a new type of concrete made of pulverized stone, sand, water, and adobe, mixed together and poured over wooden forms, hardening into a monolithic surface, an innovation born of necessity on the frontier, a material solution invented right here because the builders could not get what they needed from anywhere else. And it is through the windows of that dome, those two small, precisely placed openings, that the light finds its way in every August 15th. The architects who designed this did not do it casually. Recent research on Mission Concepción's vaulted dome roof confirms that windows were placed strategically for light to illuminate the main altar and north altar on specific feast days. This was not ornament. This was engineering. Someone sat with the sun and traced its path through the sky and calculated exactly where it would be on the evening of the Feast of the Assumption, the evening most sacred to this church's namesake, and then cut two windows in the stone at exactly the angles required to make it happen. Mission Concepción bears a formal, Romanesque-influenced massing with a dome and barrel vaults, but it also carries within it a mixing of traditions that makes it irreducible to any single style. Intricate Renaissance and Moorish details complement Romanesque forms and Gothic arches. You can see Spain in it, and you can see something that is not Spain at all, something that was born here on this particular bend of the San Antonio River. In this particular conversation between the people who brought the design and the people whose hands gave it form. The decorative elements combining Catholic symbols with indigenous natural designs reflect indigenous artisans' contributions, creating visual languages distinct from purely Spanish Baroque expression. Walk slowly through the convento rooms. Look at the ceiling frescoes, not just the famous Eye of God, but the geometric borders, the color patterns, the way forms repeat and mirror each other. These are not the frescoes of Mexico City churches. They are something that grew from a specific encounter between worlds, painted by specific hands that knew both the catechism and the land. And those hands belong to people whose story is, in some ways, the most important and the least told part of this entire history. the Coahuiltecan people. We have spoken their name throughout this story without fully stopping to honor what that name carries. They were not a single tribe. They were not one people with one language and one set of customs. The word Coahuiltecan describes hundreds of autonomous bands of hunter-gatherers who lived in temporary wickiups across South Texas and northeastern Mexico for centuries before Europeans arrived. Their territory stretched across an enormous swath of country, and they moved through it with the seasons, following the cycles of food and water and prickly pear. One of the bands near San Antonio, the Paia, had 10 different summer campsites within a 30-square-mile area. Wikipedia. Before the missions, Coahuiltecan peoples lived in small autonomous groups of 100 to 300 individuals, moving seasonally to exploit different food sources, carrying their possessions on their backs, and occupying temporary brush huts adapted to warm climates and mobile lifestyles. They had survived in this demanding landscape for thousands of years. They knew where water collected after rain, which plants held medicine, which paths the deer ran at dusk. This was not a people who needed rescue. This was a people in possession of knowledge that the Spanish, for all their theology and their iron tools and their sailing ships, did not have and could not replicate. But the 1700s are brutal to them. The Apaches push south under pressure from the Comanches. The epidemics roll through in waves. The old rhythms of life become harder to maintain. And so, from a dozen different directions, and for a dozen different reasons, people come to the missions. Not always willing, not always convinced, but they come. The mission system concentrates these dispersed bands into permanent settlements where they learn European-style irrigation farming of corn, beans, and wheat, livestock ranching, and crafts including weaving, blacksmithing, carpentry, and masonry, transitioning to sedentary agricultural life within a single generation. Within a single generation. Think about what that means. People whose grandparents had never turned soil, had never owned cattle, had never split stone with iron tools. Their grandchildren are raising limestone walls 50 feet high. Their grandchildren are painting frescoes in 4 mineral colors on vaulted ceilings. Their grandchildren are engineering irrigation canals large enough to float boats on. The speed of that transformation is astonishing. And it is also heartbreaking because what was gained in those new skills was not free. What was lost? Language, ceremony, the old names for stars and plants and seasons. That loss is immeasurable, and it is permanent. Historian Jennifer Logan has written that Coahuiltecan culture represents the culmination of more than 11,000 years of a way of life that had successfully adapted to the climate and resources of South Texas. 11,000 years. The stones of this church are 270 years old. The civilization that built it, in the deepest sense, is more than 40 times older than the building itself. And yet the descendants are still here. The Tap-Pilum Coahuiltecan Nation, comprised primarily of descendants of the Mission Indian families of all 5 San Antonio missions, traces its lineage directly to the people who lived and worshipped and built and were buried within these walls. They are not a memory. They are not a museum exhibit. Mission Indian family members participated in the battles of Concepción, the Alamo, and San Jacinto. They were there when Texas was born as a republic. They were citizens of that republic. Their blood runs through this entire history, not as a background note, but as one of its central threads. It was not until the signing of the Acto de Posesión that 3 San Antonio missions, Espada, Concepción, and San Juan Capistrano, will be owned by the native populations that had inhabited them for centuries. They are still fighting for recognition, for the repatriation of remains excavated from mission burial grounds, for the right to have their version of this history acknowledged alongside the versions written by colonial administrators and Catholic archbishops. The Tap Pilum Coahuiltecan Nation has worked for over 30 years for the return of remains of their ancestors that were previously held at universities for reburial at the missions. That work is ongoing. The story is not finished. It was never finished. There's a film that plays at the Mission Concepción Visitor Center, and in it a line appears that stops people cold every time. It says simply, "The people who built the missions are still here." The descendants of the Coahuiltecan people live all over the San Antonio area. They drive on the roads. They shop in the same grocery stores. Some of them attend Mass every Sunday in the very church their ancestors built. They carry within them something that no epidemic and no secularization decree and no century of abandonment could entirely erase. The thread of continuity that runs from those first limestone quarry days in the 1730s to this present moment, which brings us back, finally, to the building one more time. Because there's one more thing this building does, one more act of memory and intention encoded in its stone that we have touched on but not fully savored. Every year, on the 15th of August, the entire story of this place concentrates itself into a single moment of light. The descendants of the builders are in the pews. The painting that was lost for 150 years in a cathedral attic hangs above the altar. The frescoes that survived 3 centuries of weather and war and neglect glow faintly on the convento walls. The dome that was built without proper lumber, using a frontier concrete mixed by people who had never built a dome before, holds its curve above the crossing. And the sun moves into exactly the position the architects calculated it would occupy on this day. This feast day, this holy day, this one evening in the heat of a San Antonio August. And 2 beams of light come through 2 small windows, and one touches the floor, and one touches the face of Mary in the painting. And for a moment, everything is still. People in the pews go silent, open mouths, drop jaws, and then that quiet, a quiet like you've never known. That moment is not a coincidence. It is not a happy accident of geometry. It is a message written in stone and light by people who understood that the sacred lives at the intersection of the earthly and the celestial. That if you build a place carefully enough, if you understand the sun's path deeply enough, if you honor the people in the pews with enough love and enough precision, the sky itself will come inside and speak. The Franciscan architects who designed it understood that. The native hands that built it understood that. The descendants who sit in those pews every Sunday and every August 15th understand it. And now perhaps so do you. This is Mission Concepción, alive at 300 years, still catching the light. There is a question that hovers over every beautiful old building, every place that has been sanctified by ceremony and time and human longing. And the question is this: what was it actually like to live here? Not to visit, not to stand in the nave on a guided tour and feel the coolness of the stone, but to wake up here, to eat here, to work from before sunrise until after dark inside these walls, day after day, year after year, in a community that was at once home and something other than home, sanctuary and enclosure, both. We know what Mission Concepción looked like in its prime. We have inventories. We have inspection reports. We have marriage records and burial registers. We have the walls themselves still standing. And from all of that, we can reconstruct something close to the texture of a day. It begins before dawn. Every day at dawn, the Padre tolled the mission bells to summon the community to morning prayer. The bells of Mission Concepción rising over the South Texas flatland in the hours before sunrise. That sound traveling across the fields and the acequia and the cattle pastures, reaching into the rows of stone and adobe quarters where the community slept. Everyone hearing it. Everyone expected to respond. At dawn, one of the Indian singers whose turn it was that week rang the bell, and those who went to school assembled and swept the rooms thoroughly. The singers chanted the morning prayer in the choir. The friar was present for all of it, noting those who had failed to perform their duty so they could be reprimanded later. This is the texture of discipline that ran through the mission day. It is important to say plainly, life inside the mission was regimented in ways that many of its residents had not chosen and could not easily leave. Those who ran away were often tracked down and returned. Once in the mission, new converts were expected to remain there until they were fully converted and became full members of the congregation. The missions have always been held in a kind of complicated tension between what they offered and what they demanded, between the genuine bonds of community that formed within their walls and the colonial power that those walls also enforced. This is not a story with clean heroes and clean villains. The Franciscan priest who served here and Mission Concepción was always home to just one or two of them, responsible for the spiritual lives of hundreds. Many were men of genuine faith who worked themselves to physical exhaustion for communities they believed they were saving. They built the infirmaries when the epidemics came. They buried the dead. They recorded every baptism and every marriage in leather-bound books that still exist today, preserving the names of people who might otherwise have been swallowed entirely by history. And at the same time, the system they served was colonial to its bones, designed to remake people rather than receive them. Communication itself was a profound challenge. Between 1718 and 1793, at least 150 separate Indian groups speaking numerous languages and dialects had one or more individuals of the 5 San Antonio missions. 150 groups inside the walls of Mission Concepción alone. On any given morning in the 1730s or 1740s, you might hear people speaking Pajalat, Takame, Siquapil, Tilpacopal, Patumica, Patalca, languages so different from each other that neighbors could not understand neighbors. Languages the priests themselves could not understand. In 1737, Father Gabriel de Vergara, the president of the Texas Querétaro missions who lived at Mission Concepción, tried to address this by standardizing communication. He attempted to institute Pajalat as the major spoken language of the mission, publishing a Pajalat Spanish glossary and manual for missionaries, essentially writing one of the first indigenous language learning guides in Texas history, so that the priests could at least begin to speak to the people they were supposed to be serving. Think about that image. A Franciscan friar in the convento rooms off the nave of this church, bent over a manuscript by candlelight, trying to transcribe the sounds of a language he barely understands, trying to build a bridge between worlds with ink and parchment. The Pajalat people, the most prominent group at Mission Concepción, had given their name to the great Acequia. Members of the Pajalat tribe alternated holding the gobernator and alcalde offices, the governor and mayor positions of the mission's civil government with members of the Takame people. They had political leadership here. Their name was carved into the very waterway that gave the mission life, and a friar was learning their language in the hope of reaching their hearts. After morning prayer and the sweeping and the chanting came the work, and the work was immense. An 18th century inventory describes the mission as possessing a communally owned river dam, a chicken coop, an infirmary, an archive, a blacksmith shop, a cemetery, a baptistry, and a granary. By 1762, the friary was located next to the church, and a large hall with 2 storerooms extended west of the friary, containing looms for manufacturing cloth. A granary, a blacksmith shop, and a carpentry shop were also present. The Indian quarters were arranged in 2 rows on 2 sides of the church and friary. An irrigated farm was located outside the compound walls. This is a functioning industrial village. The blacksmiths are forging tools and hinges and nails. The weavers at 3 looms are producing cloth for the community's clothing. The carpenters are building furniture and doors, and the wooden forms around which the stone arches were shaped. The farmers are out past the walls, tending the fields fed by the Apache Lake Osakya, which runs down from La Valita and along what are now Garden and Roosevelt streets. A waterway so wide and deep that the Padres and the Indians traveled in canoes between La Valita and the mission. Somewhere in the compound, in the infirmary, there are sick people being tended. Somewhere in the archive, the records are being kept. Baptisms, marriages, deaths, the great bureaucratic skeleton of a colonial community whose bones were nevertheless made of human lives. The mission's baptismal record from Concepción, surviving still, begins its entries in 1733 and runs through 1790, recording 249 baptisms over those 57 years, each one a name, a date, a parentage, a small handwritten proof that a person existed and was received into the community that had gathered here on this bend of the river. At midday, the bells ring again. At noon, the community went to the church to pray the Angelus and other midday prayers, followed by a siesta of several hours. And then at 2 in the afternoon, the mission came alive again with work. By 5 in the evening, more prayers. By 7, a light evening meal. And then, as darkness came down over the South Texas plain and the stars appeared over the twin bell towers, the day wound itself to a close. In the evening, the bell tolled for vespers, which were chanted by the singers on duty for the week, and according to the importance of the feast, celebrated with organ chants. There was music here, every day, in every pueblo where a friar resided. He had schools to teach praying, singing, and playing musical instruments. The music of Mission Concepción, the chanting of indigenous singers who were learning Gregorian forms they had never encountered before the 1730s, blending them slowly with their own rhythms and their own sense of sound. That music has not been recorded. It is lost to us, but it filled these stone walls every evening, rising into the barrel vaults and the dome above the crossing, mixing with the smell of candles and the heat of a Texas sunset. Not every resident of Mission Concepción stayed. Not every Indian was eager to join, and many of those who did ran off in the middle of the night, so there was always a turnover in the congregation. The mission population fluctuated constantly, not just because of death, but because of flight. People slipping out into the darkness before dawn, heading back toward the old lands, the old rhythms, the old names for the stars. The priests would send soldiers after them. Some were brought back. Others simply disappeared into the enormous anonymity of the Texas frontier. And here's the thing that makes the story of Mission Concepción irreducibly complex. For every person who ran, there was someone who stayed, who found something real here: community, safety, friendship, faith, who buried their children in the cemetery just outside the church walls and marked the graves, who sang in the choir, who learned to cut limestone with iron tools and shape the very stones that are still standing, who, over generations, became something new, not fully what their grandparents had been, and not fully Spanish, but something that grew from the collision of those two worlds, something that would eventually call itself Tejano, and then Texan, and then simply San Antonian. The Coahuiltecan people had names recorded for more than 1,000 distinct bands over 350 years of Spanish colonial documentation. Most of those names are now unknown to the living descendants who carry their blood. The languages are gone. In 1886, an ethnologist found the last known survivors of Coahuiltecan bands: 25 Comacrudo, 1 Codo name, and 2 Pacua, living near Reynosa, Mexico. The last fluent speakers of those languages died without students. The songs they sang are gone. The names they gave to rivers and hills and the turning seasons gone. But the mission is still standing, and that is not a small thing. That is, in fact, an enormous thing, because the building that these people raised in the face of drought and epidemic and Apache raids and the long pressure of colonial transformation, that building is still here. The limestone they quarried from the ground beneath their feet is still in the walls. The fresco pigments they ground from red iron, ore, and yellow ochre and blue azurite are still in faint patches on the vaulted ceilings. The dome they built using a concrete formula invented on this frontier, poured over wooden forms by hands whose names we mostly do not know. That dome still holds its curve over the crossing, still catches the light, still stands. The walls of limestone are 4 feet thick. These are not the walls of a building meant to be temporary, meant to be replaced, meant to signal that its builders thought they would move on someday. These are the walls of people who believed, whatever else was happening around them, whatever storm they were living inside, that something here was worth making permanent, worth making massive, worth making beautiful. Even the language of the building's full name carries that weight, if you sit with it long enough. Nuestra Señora de la Purísima Concepción de Acuña, Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception of Acuña. The Acuña is a nod to the Viceroy of New Spain at the time of the mission's refounding on the San Antonio River, Juan Vasquez de Acuña, the Viceroy of New Spain in 1731. The political name, appended to the spiritual one. The church and the empire, braided together as they always were in this story. But the heart of the name is Mary, Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception, the belief that she was conceived without sin, that from the very first moment of her existence, she was untouched by the weight that presses down on all the rest of human life. It is a profound doctrine, and it is the reason this building exists. Everything, the acequia, the blacksmith shop, the weaving room, the 3 looms, the daily bells, the baptismal record with its 249 names. All of it is organized around the belief that something divine once entered the world quietly, without fanfare, without armies or proclamations, and changed everything. There is something about that idea that seems to want to find an echo in the physical world, in a beam of light moving slowly across a stone floor, in a face painted in oil that a Swiss restorer brought back from water damage and fire damage and 150 years of cathedral storage, in a building that has survived bats and barns and battles and has been, through all of it, quietly, patiently here. The name of this mission is also the name of a mystery, and perhaps that is the most fitting thing of all, that the oldest unrestored stone church in America should be named for something that cannot be fully explained, only received. The people who built it understood that. They encoded it in stone. They encoded it in light. They encoded it in a canal so wide that people could ride in canoes along it, and in 4 colors of mineral paint that are still faintly glowing on the walls after 3 centuries of weather and wind. And still on one August evening every year, when the sun falls just right and the church goes quiet, you can feel what they felt, the thing they were trying to reach, the thing they built all of this to hold. There is something that happens when you spend enough time in a very old building. You stop being a visitor and start being a listener. The stone begins to feel less like material and more like memory, compressed, pressurized, holding things it has no other way to say. And Mission Concepción, after nearly 300 years of absorbing everything that has happened within and around it, has a great deal it is still trying to say. Some of what it says comes from the official record, the inspection reports, the inventories, the baptismal registers with their careful colonial handwriting. We have drawn on those throughout this story. But there is another category of knowledge that belongs to this place. Things that are known not from documents, but from the earth itself, from the walls themselves, from the slow, patient work of archaeologists and conservators who have spent decades listening to what the building and the ground beneath it are still trying to tell us. That knowledge is extraordinary, and it begins underground. Between 1971 and 2009, 11 formal and systematic archaeological investigations were carried out within the bounds of Mission Concepción and immediately outside its walls. 11 separate digs, spanning nearly 4 decades, each one prompted by something: a road realignment, a drainage project, restoration work, a utility trench, each one revealing another layer of the story the ground has been keeping. The total number of artifacts recovered from these investigations exceeds 110,000 specimens, 110,000 objects, each one touched by a human hand, each one carrying the fingerprint, however faint, of a specific life lived in this specific place. Ceramic sherds from the mission kitchen, metal fragments from the blacksmith shop, ground stone used for grinding corn or minerals for paint. And among the most poignant of all, gun flints and arrow points made of copper, which reflect the influence of recycled materials on native technologies. Think about what that phrase means. Arrow points made of copper. The indigenous people of Mission Concepción, who had lived their entire lives making weapons and tools from chipped flint, began working with copper obtained from the Spanish colonial world, nails, pots, trade goods, and repurposing that metal into forms that matched their own tradition. They took the materials of the colonial world and made them speak in the language of their own craft. This is what survival looks like at the granular level. Not resistance and not surrender, but a constant creative negotiation with the materials at hand. The earth around Mission Concepción holds 110,000 of these negotiations. Most of them will never be fully interpreted. The people who dropped them, broke them, buried them, lost them, most of their names are lost too. But they were here. The ground remembers. And the walls remember too. When the conservators and architects finally got access to the interior of the Great Dome during the 2016 stabilization project, they expected to find structural problems. They found those. But they also found something else. During stabilization, painted plaster fragments and graffiti from the original builders were uncovered and documented, marks left inside the very dome, and the rubble fill hidden within the structure by the hands that built it in the 1740s and 1750s. Graffiti from the original builders. Inside the dome, there's something profoundly moving about that. In the cathedrals of Europe, the names of master architects are inscribed in stone, memorialized in the historical record, celebrated across centuries. Here, at Mission Concepción, the people who mixed the frontier concrete and poured it over the wooden forms and shaped the dome that has curved over this crossing for nearly 300 years. They left their marks inside the wall itself, in a place no one would see for 2.5 centuries. Not because they expected anyone to find them, but because they were here, because they existed, because something in every human being reaches toward permanence, even when the world offers no guarantee of it. Those marks are documented now. They are part of the official archaeological record of this building. They join the 110,000 artifacts in the curation facility at UTSA Center for Archaeological Research, the institutional memory of a place that has been studied longer and more carefully than almost any comparable site in Texas. But documentation is not the same as understanding. The people who left those marks in the dome, we do not know their names. We do not know what they drew or wrote. We do not know if they were Pagelat or Takame or Manos de Pero, whether they were born inside these walls or came to this mission as adults from somewhere else entirely. The ground has given us their presence, but not yet their identity. That is the condition of this history. Partial, layered, forever in the process of being recovered. And there is something almost structurally inevitable about that condition, because this is a place that has always existed at the intersection of things that resist easy resolution. The sacred and the political, the colonial and the indigenous, the documented and the unrecorded, the deliberate and the accidental, the stone that survives and the memory that doesn't. Consider the painting one more time. The great canvas of the Immaculate Conception, nearly 10 feet tall, that now hangs again behind the altar. We know so much about it. We know it was donated by wealthy patrons in Mexico City. We know a 1772 inventory listed it in the church. We know it was rolled up and carried to San Fernando Cathedral in 1794 when the mission was secularized. We know it sat in a storeroom there for 150 years. We know a historian found it in a cathedral attic in 1949. We know a Swiss restorer named Esther Schmidt-Siegfried saved it from water damage and fire damage. We know it was rededicated to this church in 2003. And we know that above the head of Mary, in barely visible burnt gold letters, there is Hebrew script that refers to an ancient name for God. Letters that were there when the painting was donated in the 18th century. Letters that traveled with it through every storage room and every archive. Letters that Siegfried restored along with everything else, without, apparently, fully understanding what they were. The experts say it is not unusual in Catholic iconography. They are probably right. But there is something about those letters that feels like a secret the painting itself is keeping, a thread from another world, another tradition, another long journey across time and geography that converged in this particular church, behind this particular altar, where once a year a beam of light falls directly across the face of Mary at the precise moment the architects intended, in the year 1755, that it should. The mysteries of this place do not feel like gaps in the record. They feel like part of the record itself. And then there are the stories that have never been in any official record. The ones passed down in families. The ones that live in the community rather than in archives. San Antonio is a city with a living tradition of oral history, of storytelling that passes wisdom and memory and warning and wonder from one generation to the next through the voice rather than the page. The missions are part of that tradition. The families who descend from the mission community have their own accounts of this place, accounts that do not always align with the documentary record, and that should not be expected to. Memory is not a transcript. Memory is an interpretation shaped by everything the community needs it to carry. Among the Tap Pilum Coawultican Nation, the missions are not simply historical sites. They are ancestral ground. The burial plots just outside the church walls at Mission Concepción hold the remains of people whose descendants are alive today in San Antonio and the surrounding counties, across South Texas and northern Mexico. The Tap Pilum Coawultican Nation has worked to reinter ancestral remains excavated from mission sites, returned from universities where they have been held for decades. Each reburial is not just an act of justice. It is a reweaving of a thread that was cut without consent, a restoration as important in its way as anything the conservators have done to the frescoes on the walls. There are other things the community carries that the written record cannot fully contain. The way the light inside the church changes as the afternoon moves toward evening. The smell of the stone in July heat and in December cold. The sound the bell towers make when the wind comes up from the south. A low resonance that you feel as much as hear. These are the things that make a place rather than a site. The things that make people keep coming back, generation after generation, to sit in the old wooden pews and look up at the dome and feel, however they want to name that feeling, whatever language they use for it. that something here is larger than any individual story. The mission has held Mass every Sunday since it reopened in 1861, with interruptions so brief they barely register against the full arc of the building's life. People baptized here, people married here, people buried here. The same threshold crossed over and over by different feet across different centuries under the same limestone arch. Today, more than 135 families claim Mission Concepción as their home parish. They are not tourists. They are not enthusiasts. They are the community of this place, continuing a relationship with these walls that stretches back nearly 3 centuries. And on the first Saturday of December each year, something happens at Mission Concepción that connects the present community to the oldest layers of this story in a way that no document could fully capture. More than 400 Mattachine dancers gather on the grounds in colorful, traditional dress, performing devotions that have been part of the life of this mission since the 1770s, traveling from the river up to the mission in a procession of prayer and dance. The Mattachines. This is a tradition so old it predates the Texas Republic, predates Mexican independence, predates the secularization of the missions. It is a dance that came from the intersection of Spanish and indigenous culture. Some say it has roots in the Moorish traditions that Spain brought to the New World. Others trace its choreography to indigenous ceremonial movement, and the truth is probably that it is, like Mission Concepción itself, an irreducible mixture of both. The dancers wear elaborate headdresses. They carry gourds and bows. They move in complex, ancient patterns that have been handed down not through written notation, but through the bodies of the people who learned them from the generation before. When more than 400 of them gather on the grounds of Mission Concepción, they're doing something that was done here in the 1770s. While the mission was still an active community of the colonial era, they are keeping a living link between the 18th century and the present. They are honoring the people who are buried in the earth beneath their feet. They are saying, in the oldest language available to the human body, we are still here. We remember. We continue. The ground holds 110,000 artifacts. The walls hold graffiti left by builders whose names we don't know. The painting holds Hebrew letters. The dome holds the rubble that was poured into it by hands that left their marks inside, not for posterity, but simply as proof of presence. And on one evening each August, and on one December Saturday each year, the living community comes back to this place and adds its own layer to the record that the building has been keeping since 1755. Nothing here is finished. No story that matters ever is. The archaeologists are still digging, carefully, methodically, always learning something new. The conservators are still watching the frescoes, monitoring the moisture, patching the mortar. The parish is still gathering every Sunday. The Mattachines are still dancing. The solar illumination still happens every August 15th if the sky is clear. And somewhere in the ground beneath the courtyard, beneath the granary, beneath the acequia that once ran wide enough for canoes, there are things not yet found, waiting for the right question, waiting for the right technology, waiting for the right person to come along and know how to listen to what the ground is trying to say. Mission Concepción has been waiting patiently for nearly 300 years. It is very good at waiting. Every building that matters, every place that carries the weight of genuine history, eventually becomes inseparable from the people who fought to save it. Mission Concepción is no exception. Across its 300 years, it has been built by people whose names we mostly don't know, abandoned by institutions that should have known better, repurposed as livestock quarters and military depots and seminary grounds. And finally, painstakingly, generation by generation, person by person, return to something close to what it always was meant to be. That return does not happen by accident. It happens because specific people decide that it matters and give their lives to the work. We have already spoken of the archaeological teams, the conservators, the restoration architects. But there is one figure in the modern story of Mission Concepción who stands out the way certain people simply do. Not because they were the only one who cared, but because the scale of what they accomplished is simply too large to pass over. His name is Father David Garcia. He grew up in San Antonio. His family crossed the river in 1700, when it was all New Spain. They stayed through every change of flag: Spanish, Mexican, Republic of Texas, United States, Confederate, United States again, and never left their home. The borders kept crossing them. He was ordained a priest in 1975, and for 4.5 decades, he did something that almost no one else could have done. He made San Antonio's sacred spaces the concern not just of the Catholic community, but of the entire city. When he was appointed rector of San Fernando Cathedral in 1995, he found it falling apart, the dome ready to collapse for a second time. He had never done large-scale fundraising. He had no template for this work. He simply looked at what was crumbling and said, "We have to preserve this." And he started knocking on doors. He raised $21 million to restore San Fernando Cathedral, completed in 2003, and then raised $15.5 million for the restoration of the churches in the 4 Spanish missions. $36.5 million for buildings that many people drove past every day without a second glance. He achieved this, as people who knew him describe it, through a combination of charisma, persistence, genuine theological conviction, and a gift for making people understand that these buildings belong to everyone, not just to the Catholics who worshiped in them, not just to the historians who studied them, but to the whole living fabric of a city that was born from the same soil. "People in town see me coming, and they usually run away," he once said, laughing, "because they know, this guy's going to get my wallet." He could laugh about it, because the results were undeniable. The cathedral was restored. The mission churches were stabilized and renewed. And through more than 8 years of coordinated effort, Father Garcia was instrumental in the effort to have the old Spanish missions recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The designation that arrived on July 5, 2015, and placed Mission Concepción in the company of the pyramids, Machu Picchu, and the Great Wall of China. San Antonio Missions is one of only 2 World Heritage Sites in the United States related to Hispanic history, culture, and identity. That is a fact worth sitting with. In a country with 24 designated UNESCO World Heritage Sites, only 2 speak specifically to the Hispanic heritage that shaped so much of the American Southwest. And Mission Concepción is one of 5 missions at the heart of that designation. Father Garcia retired in 2019 after 44 years of service. He celebrated his final Mass as pastor at Mission Concepción, the church he had spent decades saving, the church where the solar illumination happens, the church whose dome he had girded with a metal tension band to keep it standing. Mission Concepción's unrestored authenticity was one of the specific elements cited in the UNESCO nomination as contributing a unique element to the overall narrative that earned the designation. The very quality that distinguishes it from all the other missions. The fact that it has never been torn down and rebuilt, that it still holds its original materials, its original proportions, its original character. That quality was the result of being the only mission that somehow avoided the worst of what time did to the others. Of all the San Antonio missions, Mission Concepción alone avoided the serious structural deterioration that damaged the others, while Mission San Jose suffered a devastating collapse of its dome and roof on Christmas Eve of 1874 during midnight Mass. Concepción held. The Franciscan builders who chose their limestone carefully and set their walls 4 feet thick made a decision in the 1740s that has protected this building for nearly 3 centuries. That is craftsmanship speaking across time. And now the San Antonio River itself is speaking across time in a new way as well. In 2013, an 8-mile extension of the River Walk, completed in 2013, connected Mission Concepción, San Jose, San Juan, and Espada via hiking and biking trails along the San Antonio River, in what became known as the Mission Reach. The project was one of the most ambitious urban ecosystem restoration efforts in Texas history. Over 23,000 trees were planted along this 8-mile section of river, and more than 200 species of native plants were restored along its banks. The San Antonio River, which had been straightened and channelized in the mid-20th century to manage flooding, an act that stripped it of its natural character and turned it into something that looked more like a drainage ditch than the living waterway that sustained a civilization, was given back its curves, its pools, its riffles, its native grasses and cottonwoods, and the birds that come where living water runs free. The Mission Reach flows past over 400 acres of restored riparian habitat, and today you can walk or bike or paddle from the King William Historic District all the way south past Mission Concepción and on to Mission Espada, following roughly the same path that James Bowie scouts followed on the night of October 27, 1835, when they moved through the fog and the pecan trees toward the Horseshoe Bend where history was waiting for them. The river connects these places the way it always has, not just geographically, but meaningfully. The same water that fed the Pajalik Acequia, that the friars navigated in canoes, that absorbed the blood of the Battle of Concepción, that runs past the graves outside the old church wall. That water is still moving. The Mission Reach has made it possible to experience that continuity on foot, on a bicycle, in a kayak, in real time, in the middle of a living city. This is what Mission Concepción has always done, in the end. It has connected things that seemed disconnected, the sacred and the civic, the indigenous and the colonial, the past and the present, the archaeological record and the living congregation, the stone that stays and the light that moves, the architects of the 18th century and the visitors of the 21st. The 5 missions together tell a comprehensive story of Spanish colonization strategies that individual missions in other regions cannot convey, with Mission Concepción's unrestored authenticity contributing what no other mission can offer: the unmediated experience of standing in a space that has not been significantly altered since the people who built it walked its floors. There are roughly 40 UNESCO World Heritage Sites in the Americas. Machu Picchu, the historic center of Havana, the old city of Quebec, the historic district of Oaxaca, Chichen Itza, and Mission Concepción on its 3 miles south of downtown San Antonio at 807 Mission Road, accessible by foot along the river or by bus from the River Walk, or by bicycle along 15 miles of Mission Reach Trail, or by simply driving and parking in the free lot that the National Park Service maintains there. 1 million people visit every year. Most of them are surprised by how quiet it is, how solid the stone, how the light inside is different from the light outside, as if the building has made its own agreement with the sun about what enters and what stays at the threshold. They walk through the low doorways, low enough that you have to duck, and they find themselves inside something that has been absorbing human presence for nearly 3 centuries, and they feel it, whatever they want to call that feeling. Some of them arrive on August 15th and take a seat in the pews before 6:30 and wait. And then the light comes. 2 beams, one to the floor, one to the face of Mary. And for a moment, everything that has ever happened in this place, the drought in East Texas, the lady in blue, the canoes on the Apache, the pecan nuts falling in the battle fog, the smallpox epidemic of 1739, the roller canvas in the cathedral attic, the builder's graffiti in the dome, the 400 Mattachine dancers in December, the $36 million raised by a priest who made people understand what was worth saving. All of it concentrates into a single still point of light, and the church goes quiet. It is one of those moments that you carry with you, the kind that doesn't announce itself as significant until later, when you find yourself thinking about it again in some ordinary moment, washing dishes, sitting at a red light, listening to rain on the roof, and you realize that something shifted in you when that light fell on that floor and that face, that something in you recognized something without being able to say quite what. That is what Mission Concepción does, if you let it. It does what all great buildings do. Not the famous ones, not the grandiose ones, but the ones that were built from genuine need by genuine hands for something genuinely believed in. It makes you feel, for a moment, that you are part of a story much longer than your own life. That the walls around you remember more than you do. That the light moving through the windows has fallen on faces you will never know, and carries those faces forward even now, toward you, across 300 years. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. There is a room in the convento of Mission Concepción that most visitors walk past without knowing what it is. It is upstairs, in the two-story section of the building that is attached to the church's sacristy. A stairwell leads up from the ground floor, worn smooth by 3 centuries of feet, and at the top of that stairwell is a small office. Modest, austere, the kind of room that communicates authority through its very simplicity rather than through decoration or grandeur. This was the office of the Father President of the College of Querétaro. Mission Concepción was home to the Father President of the College of Querétaro, the Querétaran Father President, who was in charge of the 3 Querétaro missions in San Antonio: Mission Concepción, Mission San Juan, and Mission San Antonio de Valero, the one that history would later call the Alamo. Think about that. The person who sat in that upstairs office, looking out over the mission compound and the field beyond and the San Antonio River glinting in the distance, was the administrative center of a spiritual enterprise that included the Alamo. The Alamo, which would become perhaps the most famous building in Texas history, was under the pastoral authority of whoever sat in that room at Mission Concepción. They were colleagues. They shared a mission chain, an irrigation system, a colonial project, and a community of faith. And the headquarters of that entire network of the 3 Querétaran missions was here, in this unassuming upstairs office at 807 Mission Road. The convento measured 86 feet long by 42 feet wide overall, with the 2-story portion approximately 28 feet square. It was completed in 1759 under Master Mason Geronimo Ibarra, using rubble limestone walls 2 to 3 feet thick and barrel-vaulted ceilings of tufa stone. It is an L-shaped building with a 3-bay arcaded corridor on the west side featuring Moorish-style arches, a detail that carries, in miniature, the full sweep of Spanish architectural history, from the Moors who shaped Iberian building traditions for 7 centuries, across an ocean, to this particular bend of the San Antonio River. The 4 rooms of the convento that visitors can still explore today, the storeroom, the porteria, the library, and the refectory, are not merely historical spaces. They are the bones of a functioning administrative and spiritual center. The most famous of the surviving frescoes is the Eye of God, located on the ceiling of the library in the convento. The library, the room where the priests kept their books and their manuscripts and their correspondence. The room where Father Vergara probably bent over the candlelit pages of his Pagelat Spanish dictionary in 1737. The room where the Father President received reports from the other missions and wrote letters back to Querétaro, Mexico, detailing the progress and the setbacks and the hopes and the deaths of a community being built on the Texas frontier. And overhead in that room, looking down on all of it, that face in the ceiling, 2 eyes, a suggestion of facial hair, red and yellow, mineral pigments ground and mixed and applied by a hand that understood something about being seen. Mission Concepción, dedicated in 1755, is the only mission church in the Western Hemisphere that has not sustained major damage to its walls and roof. The only one in the entire Western Hemisphere, from the tip of Patagonia to the Arctic Circle, from the California coast to the Florida Panhandle. Every other mission church that was built during the Great Age of Spanish colonial evangelization has been damaged, reconstructed, heavily restored, or lost entirely. Mission Concepción is the sole survivor of the original form. The walls you can press your hand against are the original walls. The vaulted ceiling above your head is the original vaulted ceiling. The dome is the original dome, now girded with a metal band to keep it standing, but shaped by the same hands and the same frontier concrete formula that created it in the 1740s. That is extraordinary, and it is not the result of luck alone. It is the result of craftsmanship. The stone church was designed by master mason Antonio Teo around 1740 and built directly on bedrock, not on rubble, not on fill, not on the accumulated debris of earlier structures, but on bedrock. The people who built this church intended it to last. They chose their site with geological attention. They quarried the best local stone, that dense white limestone, sometimes called Concepción stone, for the exposed facades. They built walls 4 feet thick. They designed a dome using an innovative frontier concrete. They set iron crosses atop the 2 bell towers. And they were right, it has lasted. By the mid-18th century, the mission's herds exceeded 700 cattle and 1,800 sheep, and cotton had been introduced to the fields by 1756. This was not a church surrounded by modest subsistence farming. This was a productive agricultural and ranching enterprise at the scale of a significant colonial outpost, feeding its own community and supplying the region. At its peak, Mission Concepción was a genuinely prosperous place, and the stone church at its center was not an afterthought or a symbol of ambition beyond the community's means. It was an expression of exactly what this community had become: substantial, rooted, real. The convento was finished 4 years after the church, in 1759. The whole compound, church, convento, walls, Indian quarters arranged in 2 parallel rows, workshops, granary, quarry, was the result of nearly 3 decades of sustained labor from the time the mission arrived on the San Antonio River in 1731. 3 decades of cutting stone, mixing mortar, hauling timber, shaping arches. 3 decades of people arriving at this place from scattered and broken communities and finding, in the act of building something together, a reason to stay. The stairwell to the Father President's office is still there. You can climb it. The steps worn smooth. The walls close on either side. And at the top, that small room, that window looking south toward the river, that silence that has been accumulating for nearly 3 centuries in this building, where so much was decided, so much was suffered, so much was built, and so much was lost, and so much somehow survived. We have arrived, in this story, at a kind of threshold ourselves. We have moved from the piney forest of East Texas in 1716 to the UNESCO certificate of 2015. We have walked with the Hazanai and the Coahuiltecan and the Franciscans and the soldiers and the painters and the farmers and the vaqueros and the pecan-eating rebels and the archaeologists and a priest named Father David who spent 4 decades making sure this place did not fall. We have stood inside the dome and outside the dome, and in the library where the eye of God looks down, and in the nave where the light comes in on August 15th and changes everything. What remains? What remains is the thing that has always been there, underneath the history and the architecture and the archaeology and the politics and the faith. The thing that every person who ever stepped through the low doorway of this church was reaching toward in one way or another. A sense of something larger than individual life. A sense that what we build with our hands can outlast us. A sense that the stories we carry in our bodies, the dances, the songs, the names for things, the ways of moving through a landscape that has been home for 10,000 years, that these things are worth preserving, worth fighting for, worth raising 300-year-old stone walls to hold. Today, Mission Concepción is an active parish, with many members tracing their roots to the mission residents of long ago. The descendants of the people who built it are still here. The faith that motivated its construction is still practiced within its walls every Sunday. The light still comes through the dome windows. The Mattachine dancers still come in December. The double solar illumination still happens every August if the sky is clear. And underneath the courtyard, 110,000 artifacts are quietly archived, each one a small mute fact about a life that was lived in this specific place on this specific earth. The mission's full name runs Nuestra Señora de la Purísima Concepción de Acuña, Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception of Acuña, named for the mother of Jesus and the Viceroy of New Spain. The sacred and the political braided together from the beginning, as they have remained throughout this entire story. But there is one more name this mission carries that has not been spoken yet. It is the name the Pagelat people gave to the Great Canal, the acequia that was wide enough for boats that ran from La Valida south to these fields, that carried the river's water for 140 unbroken years before the San Antonio City Council closed it down in 1869. They called it the Pagelat. Their name, their word, their mark on the landscape that outlasted the language itself, survived in documents and historical markers, and the street names that still trace the canal's old path through the modern city. Pagelat, a derivative of Pagelat, the people who were here, the people who held the governor's office, the people whose chief was the first elected leader of this mission's civil government, the people whose name the Franciscan priests learned to speak, whose language they transcribe in a glossary by candlelight, whose daily rhythms and seasonal knowledge and thousands of years of relationship with this particular land were transformed, disrupted, and in many ways lost, but whose presence, carved into the name of the Great Canal, has never entirely disappeared. The canal is gone, the language is gone, but the name remains, and the mission remains, and the people who carry the blood of those who built it remain, living in San Antonio and in the surrounding counties and across South Texas, tracing their roots back to this courtyard, this acequia, this stone, this light. There is a phrase that appears in the film shown to visitors at the mission. It is the most important sentence in this entire story. It goes like this: the people who built the missions are still here. Still here. Not in museums, not in historical documents, not only in the photogenic ruins of a colonial past, but in the living bodies of the people who attend Sunday Mass at Mission Concepción, who dance at the December Mattachine ceremony, who fight for the reburial of their ancestors' bones, who drive past these walls every day on their way to work and feel, however faintly, a thread of connection to the hands that set these stones. Mission Concepción is the only mission church in the Western Hemisphere that has not sustained major damage to its walls and roof. The only one, In 3 centuries of wars and weather and abandonment and bats and cattle and revolutions and the long entropy of time, it is still standing because the people who built it to last. And it is still alive because the people who descend from those builders have never entirely let go of it. That is the story of Mission Concepción, a story that is still being written in the footsteps of 1 million visitors a year, in the slow, patient work of archaeologists, in the weekly mass, in the August light falling on Mary's face, in the December drums of the Madachines, in the river flowing south past the pecan trees and the limestone walls, carrying everything forward that the land holds and the stone holds and the people hold. It began in East Texas, in a piney forest, on a summer morning in 1716. It has not ended yet. The numbers, when you encounter them, have a way of briefly stealing the breath. The San Antonio Mission's National Historical Park drew an estimated 1.55 million visitors in 2025, a nearly 21% increase from 2024 and 31% higher than 2023, at a time when many national parks across the country were actually seeing attendance decline. The total estimated economic output of the missions in their peak year has been as high as $165 million, the highest since records were first kept in 2012 when the figure stood at $41.9 million. In under a decade, the missions went from generating $41 million in economic activity to generating 4 times that. But then you set those numbers down and ask, what does it feel like on a Sunday morning? Because that is where the story of Mission Concepción actually lives. Not in the visitor tallies and the economic impact studies, not even in the UNESCO certificate. It lives in the ordinary Sunday, when the parking lot fills slowly in the early morning light, and the people of this parish, descendants of the white, Latinx, and Native American people who founded the early church, make their way through the low doorway into the stone interior, where everything is the same as it was when their grandparents came, and their grandparents' grandparents before that. The same limestone, the same vaulted ceiling, the same dome overhead, now repaired and strengthened, but still turning its ancient curve above the crossing. The same painting of Mary behind the altar, watching over everything with her serene gaze and her barely visible Hebrew letters. This is a living congregation in an active parish within the Archdiocese of San Antonio. The congregation currently supports food drives, assists with refugee settlement, and gives monthly subsidies to 2 local sister parishes. This is not a congregation sustained by the glamour of its address or the fame of its history. This is a community that has its own life, its own pastoral needs, its own outreach to the poor and the displaced, its own ongoing obligations to neighbors who have nothing to do with tourism or solar illuminations or UNESCO designations. And yet the weight of the building is always present. The weight in the good sense. The weight of something that has accumulated more meaning than any single life can carry, and that distributes that meaning across everyone who steps inside. When the priest at Sunday Mass looks out at the congregation from the same altar position where priests have stood since 1755, there is a depth to that view that no other church in the United States can quite replicate. Those pews hold not just the people currently sitting in them, but the ghost of everyone who has ever sat in them, going all the way back to the first Pagelat families who were baptized in this building when its mortar was still curing. Today, Mission Concepción balances an active parish life with the needs of over 2 million tourists who visit the site annually as a result of its UNESCO designation. 2 million people, in a church whose original congregation never exceeded 250. Each of those visitors bringing their own history, their own reasons for standing in that nave, their own particular way of trying to understand where they are. Some are devout Catholics who feel the sacred charge of the space immediately, the way Catholics often feel it The incense memory in the stone, the particular quality of silence that accumulates in places where prayer has been regular and persistent for centuries. Some are historians who want to place their hands on an unrestored colonial wall and feel the granularity of the limestone. Some are tourists checking a UNESCO box. Some are children on school field trips who have been told this is important and who may not understand why yet, but who are standing in a place that might come back to them decades later when they're trying to remember what permanence feels like. And some of them, a smaller number, but they exist, arrive on August 15th and stay through the evening. The double solar illumination has become something of a pilgrimage in San Antonio. Not in the formal sense. There is no organized march, no designated route, no required prayer. But people plan for it. They mark their calendars. They drive in from Killeen and Austin and Houston. They arrive early enough to secure a pew, and they wait. The church fills to capacity, spilling into the aisles, onto the floor of the transept, crowded into every available space. And then the afternoon moves toward evening, and the last hour before 6:30 has a particular quality to it, a hell-breath quality, a room full of people trying not to look too eagerly at the windows in the dome, waiting to be surprised by something they have come specifically to see. At 6:25 or 6:30 in the evening, the light beams settle on their appointed destinations. One rises slowly toward the face of Mary in the painting above the altar. The other pours down through the transept onto the church floor, and then gasps from people experiencing it for the first time, and a deep collective stillness from those who have been here before and know that the moment passes quickly and should not be interrupted. There is something that the Vatican Observatory has noted about this phenomenon, something worth pausing on. There are equivalent days in the spring that mirror these days in August and September, and around the solstice the windows will cast their beams more onto the aisle of the church at a different time of day. What this means is that the double illumination on August 15th is not the only moment when this building's windows speak to the sky. It is simply the most dramatic, the most intentional, the most named. The church is in conversation with the sun throughout the year, the way any building built with care and attention to its orientation must be. But on one evening in late summer, the conversation reaches its most eloquent point and people crowd into the pews to listen. That is the texture of what is happening at Mission Concepción right now, in our moment, in 2026. A congregation that serves refugees, an archaeological record of 110,000 artifacts, a UNESCO site attracting visitors from every continent, a solar illumination that still works exactly as it was designed to work in 1755, Mattachine dancers in December, a dome that was stabilized within the last decade, frescoes that were still being uncovered as recently as 2010, a stairwell that leads to a room where the father president of the Querétaro missions once made administrative decisions that affected the Alamo, a painting that was rolled in a cathedral attic for 150 years and came home, a canal whose name is a word in a language that no living person speaks. All of it, simultaneously always. What does it mean for a place to be this many things at once? There's a word that comes to mind, not a grand word, a simple one. The word is witness. A witness is someone who was present, someone who saw, someone who, by the fact of their continued existence, carries the record of what happened. Buildings can be witnesses the way people can. A building that has not been torn down and rebuilt, that carries its original materials, its original proportions, the original decisions of the people who made it. Such a building is a witness in the truest sense. It was there. It carries the record of everything that passed through it and around it and happened in its shadow. Mission Concepción has witnessed the full span of European presence in what is now Texas. It was conceived in the colonial expansionism of early 18th century Spain. It was built in the years when the Enlightenment was beginning to reshape European thought, when the ideas of liberty and reason were gathering force that would eventually shatter empires. It stood through the Texas Revolution, through Mexican independence, through the Civil War. It survived the era when San Antonio was a frontier cattle town, and the era when San Antonio became the 7th largest city in the United States. It has stood through 2 world wars and a dozen local floods and a pandemic that closed its doors temporarily, but could not stop its congregation from finding ways to gather, even from a distance, even through screens. During the pandemic, Father David Garcia's weekly homilies from Mission Concepción gave people of faith comfort. Parishioners reported reading them as a family every week to feel connected to the outside world and their faith. Even locked out of the building, the community of this place held together. That is what 3 centuries of continuous spiritual life produces. A bond that does not require the physical walls to maintain itself, because the walls are already inside the people. Mission Concepción is the most intact building of all 4 churches in the historic ensemble, which represents the largest concentration of Spanish colonial architecture in North America. The largest concentration of Spanish colonial architecture in North America, not in California, where the missions are more famous in popular imagination, not in New Mexico, where Spanish presence stretches even earlier. Here, in San Antonio, along a 7-mile stretch of river, where 5 missions were planted in the 18th century, and where 4 of them are still standing with their walls and their frescoes and their active Sunday congregations. And among those 4, Mission Concepción is the most intact, the one that has changed the least, the one that stands closest to what it was when the last stone was set in 1755 and the bells rang out across the South Texas plain for the first time. The park that contains it is open every day except Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's Day. Admission is free. You can arrive by bicycle along the Mission Reach Trail, following the restored bank of the San Antonio River past the cottonwoods and the restored grasses and the egrets that wade in the shallows. You can arrive by car and park in the free lot near the old limestone quarry, the same quarry that provided the stone for the building itself. You can arrive by bus on the Viva Missions route. You can, if the water is right, arrive by kayak along the same river that the Pagelat people navigated for thousands of years before the mission was ever imagined. However you arrive, the building is there waiting. The twin bell towers are there. The car portal is there. The low doorway that requires you to duck your head is there, which is itself a small act of humility, a physical gesture of entering, of acknowledging that you are crossing a threshold into something that has been here longer than you have. The cool of the stone interior is there, and the particular quality of light that passes through those thick walls, and the faint remnant colors on the vaulted ceilings of the convento rooms, and the painting of Mary behind the altar with her Hebrew letters and her restored canvas, and her 270-year history of watching over this space. And if you're there on August 15th, the light will come. It always comes if the sky is clear. That reliability, that mechanical, astronomical, absolutely faithful reliability of the sun returning to the same position every year on the same date is perhaps the most comforting thing about this entire story. In a history full of disruption and loss and displacement, and the slow, grinding pressure of colonial power on human communities, the sun has never missed its appointment. The builders of 1755 calculated where it would be on August 15th, and it has been there every year since. It will be there next August 15th. It will be there in 2055. It will be there in 2155, assuming the dome still stands and the windows remain unobstructed and someone is still willing to come and bear witness. That is the bet the builders made. That is the bet this community has been renewing every year for nearly 3 centuries. That there will always be someone willing to come and bear witness. Someone willing to sit in the pew and wait for the light and catch their breath when it arrives. Someone willing to fight for the building when it needs fighting for. To raise the funds and do the conservation work and keep the records and tell the story and teach the dances and bury the dead with dignity and argue for the repatriation of bones and plant 23,000 trees along the river and sweep the convento floors and unlock the church doors at 6 o'clock on a hot August evening so that the faithful and the curious and the simply open-hearted can gather together and receive, one more time, what the architects left for them. That bet, as of today, is still paying out. Here is something that almost no one outside of Texas history circles knows. 22 years before James Bowie and his 90 men crouched in the horseshoe bend of the San Antonio River and fired on Mexican soldiers in the fog, Mission Concepcion was already the headquarters of a revolution. A different revolution, an earlier one that almost succeeded, and whose failure sent a generation of Tejano into exile and reshaped the political landscape of an entire region. The year is 1813. Mexico is 3 years into its war of independence against Spain. The fires that Father Miguel Hidalgo lit with his famous Grito de Independencia in 1810 are burning across the continent. And in San Antonio, a revolutionary named Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara, a blacksmith from Nuevo Santander who had traveled to Washington, D.C., met with Secretary of State James Monroe and organized an army in Louisiana, has just entered the city at the head of a force of Americans, Tejano, Spanish army defectors, and indigenous fighters who together have defeated the Spanish royalists in battle after battle across Texas. The revolutionary forces of Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara chose Mission Concepcion as their headquarters in 1813. Gutierrez was part of the Hidalgo independence movement. Think about that. 22 years before the Texas Revolution, Mission Concepcion was the command center for a revolutionary government that briefly, very briefly, declared Texas an independent republic. After defeating the Spanish army in 5 battles, Gutierrez entered San Antonio on April 1st, 1813. He became, by some accounts, the first president of an independent Texas. On April 6th, he signed what could be called Texas' first Declaration of Independence and first Texas Constitution. It did not last. The execution of Spanish prisoners turned American volunteers against the movement. Internal divisions tore the army apart, and in August 1813, the Spanish General Arredondo arrived with 1,800 men and crushed the revolutionary force at the Battle of Medina, the bloodiest battle on Texas soil, executing hundreds and sending the survivors fleeing across the Sabine into Louisiana. The Spanish recaptured San Antonio and conducted brutal reprisals. Among those who fled Texas were future signers of the 1836 Texas Declaration of Independence Jose Francisco Ruiz and Jose Antonio Navarro. And through all of this, the revolutionary occupation, the military command, the declaration, the collapse, the reprisals, Mission Concepcion stood. The mission that had already seen drought and epidemic and Apache raids and the slow, grinding pressure of secularization now absorbed the noise of a revolutionary army making its last stand, and then the silence of its defeat. And when the Spanish returned and the exiles fled, the building was still there. Most mission records were destroyed during this period of upheaval. The archives that had been kept at Mission San Jose were burned or lost. The careful handwritten registers of baptisms and marriages and burials that chronicle the lives of the mission community were casualties of politics and war. Another layer of the human record, erased. Another reason why the stories that survive about this place are partial, and why the ground itself, holding its 110,000 artifacts in patient silence, is often the most reliable witness we have. This is the pattern of Mission Concepcion's history in full. It is not a story of peaceful preservation. It is a story of survival against constant disruption. The mission that began in a drought, moved through a war, arrived in San Antonio amidst a colonial expansion, built itself into prosperity, was nearly destroyed by smallpox, declined through secularization, became a barn, housed a Mexican independence army, sheltered Texan rebels, became a barn again, became a military depot, became a school, and finally became what it is now, a World Heritage Site, an active parish, and the oldest unrestored stone church in America. Every one of those lives it has lived is still present in its stones. The barn is still in the stones. The army is still in the stones. The revolution is still in the stones. The smallpox is still in the stones, held in the memories of the descendants of the people who survived it and stayed. None of it has been painted over. None of it has been plastered shut. The building is a palimpsest, a surface written on and written on again, but never fully erased, so that if you look carefully enough through all the layers, you can still read what was there before. That is what unrestored actually means when you think about it long enough. Not unrepaired, not unmaintained, not left to crumble. Unrestored means that no one has decided what this building was supposed to be and rebuilt it to look like that decision. It remains what it became, organically, through everything that happened to it. The layers are all present simultaneously. The building is its own complete history, which brings us, finally, to the question that this entire story has been circling. The question that anyone who spends real time with this place eventually arrives at. Why does it matter? Not in the institutional sense, we have covered that. National Historic Landmark, UNESCO World Heritage Site, oldest unrestored stone church in the country, first and only World Heritage Site in Texas, one of only 2 in the United States related to Hispanic history and identity. Those designations matter, and they are real, and they represent real achievement by the people who fought for them. But why does the place itself matter? In the way that places matter. In the way that a river matters more than just the water moving through it. In the way that a view from a particular hill matters more than just the topography. Here is one answer. Mission Concepcion exists at the intersection of every major force that shaped the American Southwest. The Spanish colonial enterprise, the indigenous communities of South Texas who were its builders and its casualties and whose descendants are still here. The French and Spanish imperial contest that sent the mission on its travels. The Mexican independence movement, the Texas Revolution, the Republic of Texas, the state of Texas, the United States. The long push of archaeology and conservation that is always, in every generation, trying to recover what was almost lost. All of those forces meet in this one place, at 807 Mission Road. You can stand in the nave of this church and be standing simultaneously in the 18th century and the 19th century in the present. The walls make that possible. The continuity of the stone makes that possible. And the annual return of the August 15th solar illumination, that absolutely reliable, geometrically inevitable, architecturally intentional return of the light, makes it not just possible, but felt. Because there is something about a place that has been continuously tended, that has had human hands touching it and human voices filling it and human feet crossing its threshold in prayer or curiosity or grief or wonder, in an essentially unbroken chain from 1755 to today, that produces a particular quality of presence, a density, a sense that the air inside is thicker than ordinary air, freighted with everything that has been breathed and spoken and felt and prayed in that space across nearly 3 centuries. You cannot manufacture that quality. You cannot reconstruct it. You cannot build a replica and achieve it. It is the product of time and continuity and the accumulated attention of generations. And it is one of the rarest things a place can possess. Mission Concepción possesses it in abundance. Many church members are descendants of the white, Latinx, and Native American people who founded the early church. When they sit in the pews on Sunday morning, they are not visiting a historical site. They are in their own house, the house their ancestors built, the house their ancestors were buried beside. And when they look up at the dome that was fixed with a metal girdle in 2020, the dome that was built using a frontier concrete formula in the 1740s, the dome whose rubble fill held the graffiti of its builders for 2.5 centuries. They are looking at something their family helped make and has never entirely let go of. Visitors are especially drawn to Mission Concepción, renowned as the best preserved colonial mission church in North America. Best preserved. That phrase keeps returning in different forms throughout every description of this place. Best preserved, oldest unrestored, most intact. The language is consistent because the reality is consistent. This building, more than any other of its kind in the Western Hemisphere, still looks like what it was. It has not been rebuilt to look like what someone in a later century imagined it was. It is the thing itself, and the solar illumination it was designed to produce. The double illumination where 2 beams of light simultaneously strike the face of the Virgin Mary and the painting above the altar and the central point on the floor beneath the dome, every August 15th at 6:30 in the evening. That too has not been rebuilt or restored or replicated. It still happens because the building still stands in the orientation the architects gave it in 1740. And the sun still travels the path it has always traveled. And the Feast of the Assumption still falls on August 15th, and the windows are still open. There is, when you pull back far enough to see the whole shape of this story, something almost mythological about it. A place planted in a forest in East Texas in 1716, moved twice, arriving at its permanent home on a river in South Texas in 1731, spending 24 years being built by the hands of people from a dozen decimated cultures, dedicated in 1755 on a feast day of the woman whose name it carries, surviving war and epidemic and revolution and abandonment and bats and cattle and a century of neglect, being found again, fought for, restored in the ways it needed restoring, placed on the world's most prestigious list of irreplaceable places, and now receiving over 1.5 million visitors a year. While the congregation that has been meeting here since 1861 continues to meet, and the Mattachines continue to dance, and the solar illumination continues to happen, and the descendants of the builders continue to come home. That is not a small story. That is a story about what human beings can build when they mean it. What they can keep when they decide it's worth keeping. What survives when enough people, in enough successive generations, look at something old and fragile and beautiful and say, not yet. Not this one. Mission Concepción has been saying not yet for 300 years. The stone has been saying it. The light has been saying it. And the people who built it, and the people who maintained it, and the people who fought for its recognition, and the people who sweep its floors and tend its parish and dance on its grounds in December and crowd into its pews every August 15th to catch their breath when the light falls. The people have been saying it most of all. Not yet. We are still here. We remember. We continue. The story of Mission Concepción is the story of all of us in the end. The story of what we leave behind. The story of what our children find when they arrive where we have been. The story of the light that comes back every year, on the same day, to the same place, as if it has never forgotten what it was designed to find. It hasn't, and neither should we. Let's slow down. We have moved, in this story, across 3 centuries and thousands of miles. We have stood in a forest in East Texas in 1716 and in UNESCO Committee Chamber in Bonn, Germany in 2015. We have walked through revolutions, epidemics, legal battles, and solar illuminations. And now, before we close, we should do the thing that is hardest to do in a video essay, and most essential to do if we want to actually know a place. We should walk through it, slowly, the way you walk through a building when you have nowhere to be and no particular agenda except to pay attention. So let us come through the front gate of Mission Concepción on a morning when the crowds have not yet arrived. Let us move through the grounds the way a careful visitor moves, not rushing toward the famous things, but letting the place reveal itself in the order it chooses. The first thing you notice, before you even reach the church itself, is the quarry. It sits near the parking lot, a modest depression in the ground that most people walk past without a second look. But stand at its edge for a moment and understand what you're seeing. This is where the building came from. The tufaceous limestone quarried here was used for building the mission structures, including the limestone used to make the mortar and plaster. Every stone in those 4-foot-thick walls, every arch in the convento, every step of the stairwell that leads to the Father President's office, it was cut from this earth. The building and its source are still visible to each other across a distance of a few hundred feet. You can stand in the quarry and look up at the walls and see, quite literally, where the walls came from. That specificity, the quarry still present, still visible, still part of the site, is one of the things that makes Mission Concepción unlike any comparable building in America. Most historic buildings exist in isolation from their materials. Here, the whole story of construction is still in the landscape. The land gave the stone became the church. The church is still standing, and the land it came from is right there, just past the parking lot. Now we cross toward the church's western facade, the main entrance, those twin bell towers rising against the sky, their pyramidal caps still carrying, if you look carefully, traces of pigment from when they were painted in 4 vivid colors 300 years ago. If you look closely at the bell towers today, you can still see remnants of red pigment from the frescoes surrounding the bell tower windows. Most people don't notice, but if you know to look, it's there, a faint blush of red ochre in the limestone, the last whisper of a painted church that once blazed with color in the South Texas sun. The front door of the church is locked. It has been for many years. Access to the church sanctuary is through a side entrance. This is a minor quirk that has a somewhat poetic dimension. You cannot enter Mission Concepción the way you would approach it head-on. You must come around to the side. You must approach it obliquely. There is something in that requirement that feels right for a place of this kind of layered mystery. Nothing here is quite straightforward. Through the side entrance, through the sacristy, and then you are inside. The first sensation is temperature. Even on the hottest South Texas day, and San Antonio in July and August reaches a heat that presses down on you like something with physical weight. The interior of this church is cool. Not air-conditioned cool, not mechanical cool, but the deep geological cool of thick limestone walls that have been absorbing and releasing temperature for 2.5 centuries. It is the coolness of a cave or a well. Your body recognizes it immediately as something fundamental. The second sensation is the quality of the light. You are now inside a building whose windows were designed not as decoration, but as instruments. The light is channeled to illuminate symbolically the sanctuary, its source unseen by the worshiper in the nave. You cannot always tell where the light is coming from. It arrives at angles that don't correspond to where you expect windows to be. It makes certain surfaces glow without apparent source. It turns the nave into a kind of camera obscura, a controlled space where the exterior world is admitted only on the building's own terms, and only in the quantities and directions the builder specified. Look up. The barrel vaults of the nave curve overhead in a rhythm of stone arches. And at the crossing, the dome rises above you to its more than 50-foot height, its drum pierced by the two windows whose careful angles the builders spent years calculating. On a clear afternoon, light pours down through those windows and columns that move slowly across the floor as the sun moves. The same movement in the same direction that has been happening since 1755. The church at Mission Concepción has the largest collection of fresco wall art of any of the missions at San Antonio Mission's National Historical Park. You can see remnants of it on the walls, geometric forms, color fields, borders that once announced the boundaries of devotional spaces. Most of what remains is fragmentary. The 2010 restoration uncovered more than had been seen in generations, and conservation work continues to reveal additional patches. But you must look carefully. This is not a place that announces its art loudly. You have to slow down and let your eyes adjust, the way your eyes adjust to dimness when you enter from bright sun, and then, slowly, the colors come. There is something particular about the way faded frescoes communicate. A fully intact painting tells you what the painter wanted to say. A fresco worn to fragments, to suggestions of itself, communicates the passage of time in a way that no intact painting can. When you see the ghost of a geometric pattern on an old stone wall, you are seeing not just the pattern, but its survival, which is a different and more complex thing. You are seeing 3 centuries of weather and war and neglect and the stubborn persistence of mineral pigment and limestone. And the fact that the fragment is still visible is itself part of the message. Now, come through into the convento, pass through the low doorway, duck, and you're in the porteria, the entry room. From here you can move through the storeroom, the library with its Eye of God fresco on the barrel-vaulted ceiling, the refectory where the priests ate their simple meals. When you think of all the baptisms, weddings, and funerals in 100+ years, and the fact that descendants are still part of the congregation of this place, when you think of that continuity, standing in these rooms, the silence takes on weight. The library is where most visitors pause longest. It is a small room, low ceiling, the fresco overhead, the Eye of God, or what is now understood to be 2 eyes and possibly a human face, looks down with an expression that is difficult to characterize. Not judging, not benevolent exactly, something more neutral than either of those. More ancient, more patient. It was painted by a hand that understood something about being watched and about watching, and it has been looking down at this room for nearly 3 centuries. The walls at Mission Concepción were not reconstructed in modern times. Unlike the other missions in the park, what has fallen has stayed fallen. The partial walls that remain from structures that no longer exist, the granary, sections of the convento, the defensive walls with their Indian quarters. Those partial walls are part of the site now. They are not ruins in the sad sense. They are honest. They tell you what time does, and they tell you what survives time. And the difference between those 2 things is the whole story of this place compressed into a walk through a few acres of South Texas ground. Step outside and walk around to the south side of the church. The sacristy wall is visible here, and from it protrude the broken walls of the former granary. 3 rooms of stone that once held the harvest, that once made the difference between a community that survived winter and one that didn't. They adjoined the church at its southeast corner, exactly where the 1838 survey described them. The ground here has been walked and worked and buried into for nearly 3 centuries. Underneath your feet, somewhere in the stratigraphy of that earth, are the 110,000 artifacts that archaeologists have cataloged and curated. The cemetery lies beyond the south wall. The people who were baptized in this church, married in this church, who kept its books and tended its gardens and cut its stone and mixed its mortar, many of them are buried here or nearby, in graves that in some cases have been excavated and in others remain undisturbed. The Tap-Pilum Coahuiltecan Nation has fought for, and in some cases achieved, the reburial of remains that were taken from mission sites by archaeologists in earlier decades. The ground holds what it holds. The community holds the memory of what the ground holds. When you think of all the baptisms, weddings, and funerals in this place, the sheer density of human passage through one threshold, across one set of stones, under one dome, you begin to understand why the word living is so important when applied to Mission Concepción. Not living as a metaphor, living in the literal sense, births and deaths and marriages, and the full cycle of human experience, still happening, still being marked in this building, with the same sacramental forms that were used in 1755 when the doors first opened. The missions are part of the Texas origin story, instruments of empire, conquest, anchors of community life, symbols of pride, and also sources of pain. The Alamo City has grown around them, and the debate over what they represent has grown with it. That complexity is real and should not be smoothed away. The missions are not simply beautiful. They are also the sites of the most profound cultural disruption in the history of South Texas. Places where people lost languages, ceremonies, traditions, and autonomy on a scale that is still being reckoned with by their descendants. The beauty and the loss live in the same stones. The accomplishment and the cost are both present in the same air. But what is also true? What is equally true, what the building insists on by simply continuing to stand, is that something was also built here that endured. Something that was made in the intersection of peoples and cultures and faiths and centuries of human need. Something that the founders could not have fully predicted and that no single one of them owned or controls. Something that belongs now to the millions of people who have passed through this threshold and felt, in whatever language they use for it, that they were standing inside something that mattered. For some families, including descendants of Coahuiltecan peoples, these missions are places of return and identity. For others, they're sacred spaces for weddings, funerals, quinceañeras, and celebrating Massachusetts. And for everyone who encounters them with open eyes and open attention, they are sites of memory in the deepest sense. Places where the past is not preserved behind glass, but is actively present, folded into the stone, breathing in the cool air of the nave, moving with the light across the floor. The church retains the highest level of original colonial-era materials of any of the mission churches. Its walls are the original walls. Its dome is the original dome, now stabilized but not replaced. Its frescoes are original frescoes, now fragmentary but still there. Its quarry is still visible in the ground 30 feet from the parking lot. Its Acequia Canal ran under streets that still bear its name. Its baptismal records go back to 1733, and its congregation goes back, in an unbroken arc of Sunday mornings, to 1861. And once a year on August 15th, as the Feast of the Assumption draws toward evening, and the congregation fills the pews to their edges, and the latecomers stand in the aisles, and the children sit cross-legged on the floor, a shaft of light enters through the window above the front door, and another enters through the dome window, and they travel their appointed paths, and at 6:30 in the evening, they arrive simultaneously, one at the center of the transept floor, one at the face of Mary in the painting that was once lost for 150 years in a cathedral attic and has been home since 2003. And the church goes quiet. In a world that rarely goes quiet, a world of constant information and constant noise and the relentless acceleration of everything. There is a moment in Mission Concepción on August 15th when a building built in 1755 by people whose names we mostly do not know produces a silence in a room full of human beings that cannot be manufactured or replicated or scheduled in advance. It arrives because the earth has moved into the right position, because the windows are still open, because someone built the building to catch this moment, and the building has not forgotten what it was built for. That is what it means for a place to be 300 years old and still alive. That is Mission Concepción. There is a problem at Mission Concepción that most visitors never think about, because it is invisible and slow-moving and produces no drama that a camera can easily capture. But it is, in its quiet way, one of the most urgent challenges the building faces in the 21st century. And the people trying to solve it are doing some of the most creative scientific work happening anywhere in historic preservation right now. The problem is air conditioning. That may sound almost comical, given everything this building has survived: plagues and revolutions, and a century of bat infestation, and 300 years of South Texas weather. But it is not comical at all. A fresco in Mission Concepción's baptistry, 265 years old, has already been lost to water damage and to time. And the instrument that accelerated its loss was not a flood, not a fire, not an army. It was the air conditioning unit installed in 1994 to make Sunday Mass more comfortable for the congregation. Here is the physics of it. Mission Concepción was built of porous limestone from the nearby quarry. That limestone acts like a very stiff sponge. Set in the ground, it absorbs moisture from the earth, and once that moisture is absorbed, the principles of science take over and the water evaporates out of the stone. There's an evaporation line that forms in the walls, visible if you know to look, where the moisture exits. The walls above it are drier, the walls below still cycling through wetting and drying. This is not damage. This is what the building does. It has always done this. It is, in a sense, breathing. When you force air conditioning into this building, you create two different climates, the cool interior environment and the hot exterior. And the temperature difference destabilizes the wall moisture. The condensation moves differently than it was designed to move. The evaporation cycle is disrupted. The humidity that used to pass harmlessly through the stone now concentrates in ways that attack the painted surfaces. The frescoes, the oil paintings, the delicate mineral pigments that have survived intact since the 18th century. Buildings are like people, as one researcher put it. They age. When you have an old person, you cannot think that the old person runs a marathon, but you can think that the old person is able to walk. Now we have in front of us a person that is in a wheelchair. The irony is dense and almost painful. The congregation that has sustained this building for the past century and a half, whose continued worship here is cited by UNESCO itself as one of the building's outstanding universal values. That congregation, entirely reasonably, wants to be comfortable during a San Antonio summer. Summer in this city is not a gentle season. Temperatures regularly reach the high 90s and above. A stone church built for an 18th century congregation that had never heard of air conditioning is not designed for the thermal expectations of modern parishioners. So the HVAC was installed, and it began very slowly, very quietly, to undermine the thing it was installed to serve. UTSA researchers have been working to create a new methodology to assess buildings and provide technical guidance to mitigate future damage, blending historic preservation, building performance, energy efficiency, and a desire to keep the people who use the building more comfortable. They deployed 42 sensors positioned in 10 helium balloons to model the natural and artificial dynamics of the entire volume of air in the church before, during, and after cooling. The image of that, helium balloons drifting in the nave of this 270-year-old church, each one bristling with sensors, measuring the air that has been moving through this space since 1755, is one of the stranger and more beautiful images in the modern story of Mission Concepción. The solution they're working toward is not to remove the air conditioning. It is to raise the temperature set point a little, to reduce the gap between inside and outside temperature, so the wall moisture cycle is less disrupted, so the frescoes can continue their long, patient survival without the condensation patterns that have been eating them from behind. A few degrees of difference between what the congregation experiences and what 1994 assumptions said they needed. The building, and with it, the irreplaceable painted record of the culture that created it, negotiated against comfort for survival. The researchers hope their work at Mission Concepción will serve as a model for other historic stone structures in hot, humid climates throughout the South and Southwest, potentially allowing the San Antonio missions to become pioneers in the use of energy-efficient upgrades at cultural heritage sites. That kind of ambition, using a 270-year-old building as a laboratory for 21st century conservation science, says something important about what Mission Concepción still has to offer the world. It is not just a monument to what people built in the past. It is an active site of discovery about how to preserve the past for the future. Every fresco still clinging to a wall. Every painted plaster fragment still embedded in the dome's rubble fill. Every 265-year-old pigment still holding its color against the limestone. These things have something to teach us, if we are willing to learn, about what human expression can endure and under what conditions it fails. Mission Concepción's location, just south of downtown San Antonio, closer to the urban core than the other three park missions, makes it readily accessible while presenting preservation challenges from urban development pressures. San Antonio is growing. It is the 7th largest city in the United States, and its south side neighborhoods, the neighborhoods that surround the missions, are subject to development pressures that didn't exist when these buildings stood in something closer to open country. The Mission Heritage Partners intervened years ago to prevent commercial development from filling the land between Mission Concepción and the San Antonio River, which would have erased the view corridor that has been essentially unchanged since the 18th century. That intervention, one board member purchasing the land privately and then transferring it to the nonprofit, which transferred it to the national park, protected something that might otherwise have been lost quietly and permanently. These are the kinds of decisions that determine whether a place like Mission Concepción survives into the next century in any meaningful condition. Not dramatic decisions, not heroic decisions, decisions made by people who understood that once the view is gone, it is gone. Once the fresco is lost, it is lost. Once the temperature differential has done its work for long enough, what it has eaten cannot be brought back. The recognition of the missions as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, while culturally significant, does present challenges and long-term maintenance requirements that affect multiple parties. The City of San Antonio, the Archdiocese of San Antonio, the State of Texas, and the United States National Park Service. 4 separate institutions, each with their own governance structures and budget cycles and priorities and constituencies, all responsible for the stewardship of the same irreplaceable place. The management of this complexity is itself a kind of ongoing accomplishment, one that gets very little credit because its success looks like nothing happening, which is exactly what you want in a 270-year-old building. The Mission Heritage Partners, mentioned earlier in this story, maintain more than 250,000 square feet of masonry surfaces across the National Historical Park. That is not a small number. These are not surfaces that can be left to weather indefinitely. Stone requires repointing. Mortar fails. Water finds paths. The 250,000 square feet of masonry at these missions represents a permanent, never-finished maintenance obligation that requires funding, skilled labor, and the kind of institutional attention that persists even when there are no dramatic restoration projects underway, even when everything looks fine, which is precisely when the invisible work must continue. And the work is not only physical. The stories that this place holds are also in need of stewardship. The marriage records, the baptismal registers, the 18th century inventories that tell us about the chicken coop and the infirmary and the blacksmith shop. These documents exist in archives in San Antonio and Mexico City and Austin, and they are fragile, and they are not all fully digitized, and some of them have already been partially destroyed, as we have seen. The record of who lived here, who built this, who died here and was buried in this earth. That record is a kind of architecture in its own right. A paper building as important as the limestone one, and equally in need of care. There are also the stories that have never been recorded at all. The oral histories, the family memories, the generational knowledge that passes not through documents, but through the mouths and bodies of the people who carry it. The Tapilum Coahuiltecan Nation carries forward the stories of this place through narratives rooted in ancestral wisdom, the threads that connect generations and preserve unique identity, stories that no archive can contain, that no restoration project can reconstruct, that can only be kept alive by the people who hold them and by the conditions that allow those people to remain connected to the place that those stories are about. That is the most precarious kind of preservation. It cannot be funded by a grant. It cannot be measured by a sensor or monitored by a helium balloon. It requires simply that the community remain in relationship with the place, that the descendants of the builders be welcomed here, that their claims to this ground be honored, that their version of this history be part of what is told when this history is told, which is why we are here telling it. Every documentary about a historic place is also, in some sense, an act of preservation. Every time this story is told, in a classroom, in a film, around a kitchen table, in a video essay that someone watches on a phone or a laptop in a room anywhere in the world, it becomes a little harder for Mission Concepción to be forgotten. A little harder for the fresco that was lost in the baptistry to be the last one lost. A little harder for the view corridor between the church and the river to be built over. A little harder for the 110,000 artifacts in their archive to go unstudied. A little harder for the Mattachine dancers to lose their grounds. A little harder for the August 15th illumination to happen in an empty church. Stories are a form of attention, and attention is what keeps things alive. This building has been receiving attention for 3 centuries. From a Franciscan priest who wrote its inventories, from the Querétaro archivists who preserved its records, from the Texas historian who found its rolled canvases in a cathedral attic in 1949, from the scientists who string helium balloons in its nave and read the air, from the 400 Mattachine dancers who come every December, from the 135 families who come every Sunday, from the 1.55 million people who came in 2025 to stand inside something that has been absorbing attention for nearly 3 centuries and has grown richer for it. Preservation is never finished because a 300-year-old building is always asking for more care. The asking is not a burden. The asking is what it means to be in relationship with something that matters. Mission Concepción is asking, has always been asking, and generation after generation, the people who love this place have answered. This concludes our journey through the history of Mission Concepción. As a reminder, if you're looking for resources to help you relax and sleep better naturally, be sure to check out the link in the description below. Don't forget to like this video, and be sure and subscribe and turn on notifications so you know when the next journey through history is ready to embark on. Thanks again, and have a good night.